It's been almost 8 years since I've sat down to retell the story, so forgive any, I don't know, stumbling in clarity on my part. Even now, sitting in front of my laptop, a lit joint burning closer to the filter in my right hand, and a bottle of whiskey just beside me on my left, half of both already consumed, as I recall the events of that day. I can feel the familiar tremor starting in my hand, one that I know will only grow more pronounced and difficult to stifle as the memories are brought to the surface. Still, I've spent enough years battling with the decision to share what happened, and more than that, dealing with the consequences it can have. And ultimately, I know now the decision to share my story is the right one. I believe people have the right to know what's out there, and if there's a possibility that I can stop anyone else from going near that place, from going near the shores of Crabbers Bay, I can perhaps prevent that thing that took my brother from hurting anyone else. The fact that other people have fallen victim to the evil of that place, that anyone else has met the same fate as my brother, lingers with me, haunting me nearly as much as the final seconds I saw him, and ultimately saving lives means more to me than the prospective ridicule this may garner, or the pain reliving it will cause. I suppose I should start. Lest I manage to convince myself against it or fall apart before I complete the story, I got a job to do now, a warning to give that I wish my brother and I had had when playing near the shores of our beloved lake house. If ever you find yourself in the area, beware the shores of Crabbers Bay. And do not be lured by its strange phenomena, those shores teeming with little arthropods, for they are little more than an omen of something far darker. Beware the cloaked woman who wanders along the shore. I call it top bunk. No fair. You got it last time. It's my turn, Dad said. Gonna have to beat me to it, then. My brother Ryan said, breaking into a full sprint from the front door and up the stairs before he'd even finished speaking. Ryan was the younger of the two of us by a year, though you wouldn't be able to tell given our appearances or dynamic. He was always the more outspoken and brazen of the two of us, and paired with the fact that he was unusually big for his age and in more cases than one, finding himself in scraps with, and beating some of my bullies, all of whom, like me, were a grade older than him. By the time of our final trip to the lake house, though he was only 11, he stood taller than me and had grown into a pretty brazen kid, never one to back down from any challenge and seemingly goaded by the idea of risk. I suppose because of his size and how he was often treated as a kid much older than he truly was, Ryan felt the need to be the tough kid, to be my protector, even though I should have been his. And because of that, he's gone, and I'm here when it should have been the other way around. It was mid-August, and the end of summer was hurtling closer, evident by the waning hours of sunlight, and the subtle creep of the winter chill in the air, most apparent at night. And our mother and father decided that we ought to take advantage of the rapidly fading benefits of summer, allowing my brother and I one last hurrah before school began and the unforgiving northeastern winter settled in. My brother and I had thrown our bags together, practically loading the car ourselves when our parents told us that we would be departing that night for our last lake house visit of the summer. The beach house had been in our family for generations, constructed by our great-grandfather, who was also the first person to settle on the shores, the first member of the very community in which it sat, which became Fiddler Grove, a small but wealthy little village built behind the cover of a thick northeastern forest that entirely hid the several acres of discreet, private shore that would come to be known as Crabbers Bay. The reason for the name was simple. Crabbers Bay had a unique quirk, a phenomenon really, that made it quite unlike any other and was responsible for the community that had grown around it when the sun set. The shores of Crabbers Bay become teeming with creatures of all shapes and sizes, utterly unlike anything you've ever seen. It was something of a tradition of our families ever since our grandfather had died to make the drive out to the house that our father had grown up in within Fiddler Grove and appreciate the environment in a way he never had growing up. For my brother and I, it was a time represented by one thing and one thing only: the beach. Our father had grown up with a father who was a kind man, but demanded respect and maintained one rule with which he was oddly strict, that our father was not to be found anywhere near the shores of the bay, especially near sunset, due to it being dangerous. Reportedly, our grandfather's warm and personable attitude would grow unrecognizably dark the few times my father was caught sneaking out to play near the shores when he was our age, and the punishment that would follow was uncharacteristic. I suppose that's partly why he made such a point of allowing us that joy, and we did find such joy in it by the time we were passing the city limits. In the small coastal town nearest the little village where the beach house was, My brother and I were practically buzzing with excited energy. The scent of sea salt was growing more pronounced, stoking the flames of our excitement even more as the wind whipped in through my brother's side window, opened only halfway at our parents' request, our mom not wanting us to catch something due to the very present chill in the air. As we neared the house, the sight of the shore ahead and the large gray expanse of water beyond it disappeared behind the trees, and within minutes we'd driven up the long winding driveway that coiled up the hill towards the house like a great stone serpent, and into the shadow, the massive old colonial mansion parking the car under the archway, extending between the house and garage. Within minutes, my brother and I had practically tumbled out of the car, and after taking in a breath of salty seaside air mixed with the sweet smell of forest greenery that served as the signature scent of the area, we sped into the house, falling right back into the same argument we had every time we arrived as my brother sped ahead to that bedroom that had once belonged to my grandfather and now served as our guest room. The old house seemed to groan its welcome as our arguing voices and racing footsteps across the old wooden floors and up the winding staircase echoed through those halls, which still felt so cavernous as a child, inundating the sleepy, creaky old colonial on a hillside by the shore with a life it hadn't had since our last visit. My brother raced ahead of me, speeding past hopelessly, taking full advantage of his greater height and athleticism, nodding up the spiral staircase and down the stairs overhead, showering me with dust from the old light fixtures, swaying under his footfalls. I cried out another complaint to the air he previously occupied, quickening my pace while trying not to lose my footing, scrambling up the stairs, backpack in hand. I raced through the upstairs hall, making such a sharp left into the first open door that I narrowly avoided running into the door frame. The room was just as we'd left it, with perhaps a bit more dust, and the addition of my brother's stuff somehow already scattered messily around. Ryan sat atop the bunk bed nearest the wall, and a massive window with a view of the gray shores below. A smug grin of satisfaction was prominent on his face as I trudged across the room, making certain hand gestures at him as I threw my bag onto the lower bunk. Ryan leaned over the side of the bed, holding himself up with one hand, gripping the window frame, flicking open the two locks on either side of the window, and sliding it open with a grunt. A cloud of dust wafted from the sides, as the window groaned its protest at being opened for the first time in months. The familiar and ever-present sense of salt water and morning dew rolled in on a breeze, transforming the thin white curtains on either side of the window into bedsheet ghosts and filling the room. I caught my brother's eye, the same thought occurring to both of us as we breathed in the scent, a swell of nostalgia and excitement rising within us. The beachfront from our childhood, the portion of shoreline behind our house, has been my brother and I's playground on many a summer night and the setting of many of our best memories together as a child during the day. It would transform into an imaginary battleground as we fended off legions of pretend pirates docking ships with massive black flags looming overhead all along the shore. And during the evenings, when the peculiarities of that particular beach became apparent, and the sands became covered in legions of moving black things that seemed to reflect the light off of slip shells, blank crabs scuttled across it, emerging from under rocks and shells and fallen branches, and out of the water, seemingly claiming dominion over the beach. My brother and I could always be found out in our beach attire with sand buckets at our sides, collecting and subsequently freeing the strange land spiders. Looking back through the always clear lens of hindsight, I suppose the strange phenomena of our property should have been more daunting to us. I've never seen anywhere as abundant with the creatures as our property would become when the sun began to set, with so many of them so abnormally large. If ever any one of us had chosen to dig deeper, to peel back the layers of what we had so readily accepted as normal, and understand just what it was that made these shores different, just what drew these legions of animals here. Who knows? Perhaps, somehow, we'd never have gone back, and Ryan would still be here. We were just kids, though, and as curious as we were, it had never truly occurred to us to question the nature of the shore that in the late evening grew teeming with crustaceans, since it had always just been that way. It became ordinary to us. And it wasn't until the events of that final trip that we would be forced to face the horrifying reality. Without skipping a beat upon reaching the room, we'd torn the bags open, thrown on our swimsuits, and grabbed our plastic beach buckets, and were out of the room in a blur, racing down the hall just as we had moments prior. Ryan, running out to the lead as usual, narrowly missed colliding into our father, arriving with his and mother's luggage at the top of the stairs. As we sped by, Ryan reached the back door that opened up onto the patio first, Grabbing the plastic bucket we used to use for sandcastles as children from the pile of beach toys kept near the door. And after a few moments of fumbling with the logs, we were racing down the stairs of the deck and down the path to the beach. The sound of my brother and I clambering down the wooden porch steps and our excited chatter filled the air, along with the continuous whooshing sounds of the water against the shore as it approached and receded. The beach was clear of any wildlife at this point, with the exception of the lone seagull flitting through the sand or circling overhead. Not quite yet the time of day at which the namesake peculiarity of Crabbers Bay became apparent. At that point in the day, with the late afternoon sun still setting high above in the sky, the beach was just like any other private beach in a quiet community. And while we waited for the shores to fill with their namesake creatures, the beach was ours. And we would enjoy it, as was typical for kids, racing to see who could swim farthest out without passing the buoys, flinging balls of mud and sand at one another, and building and subsequently destroying each other's sandcastles. That was how we spent the next hour, watching the sun disappearing beneath the horizon, painting the sky wondrous hues of yellow and orange until the time drew near. I glanced at the sky. Taking note of the approaching darkness, it was almost time, that time in the late evening during which the odd phenomena of Crabbers Bay became apparent. Behind me, Ryan splashed about in the water, trying to catch some small fish that had wandered too close to shore by hand as I scanned the beachfront, and the sandy hills leading up to the greenery spilling forth from the forest above, searching for even the slightest sign of movement in the sand. "It's almost time," my brother called from behind me, standing with his face towards the setting sun, hands cupped over his eyes for protection. He trudged forward out of the shallows, grabbing the plastic bucket from the sand in his right hand and cupping his eyes with his left until he was right beside me. Back turned, scanning the beach just as I was. Raced to see who finds one first. He finished, shooting me a grin with a familiar, competitive glint in his eyes. A smirk made its way across my face as I continued my visual search of the area for the tiniest shuffle of movement in the sand, or flits of darkness speeding out of the brush of the forest, spilling over the sandy sides of their hills towards the water, hoping to spot one and accept the challenge all in one breath. Likely the only way I'd beat my brother in any sort of race. I suppose this is the point at which the story begins to seem odd to you from my experience. This is the point in the tale when the psychiatrists stop and mention never having experienced anything similar, despite plenty of time on the beach. My reply is always the same: you haven't been to Crabbers Bay. It was the very reason the community had come to exist, a strange, seemingly unexplainable phenomena of nature that happened to make those original proprietors, the first fishermen and crabbers who settled here, supposedly stumbling over this gold mine of land by chance, claiming this strip of shore and the surrounding forest as their own, my great-grandfather among them, a generational wealth. The stories of the original crew who discovered the bay always seemed to shift and change based on when it was being told. My father himself admitted he'd never received a consistent answer, but the basics were the same. A group of crabbers struggling to make ends meet set out for a day of work when a record-breaking storm hits the area, throwing them off course and nearly capsizing them on the rocky shores. The storm would begin to wane as the sun started to dip below the horizon, and as the men floated gently into a bay, none of which had ever seen before. And upon bringing up the nets to check for tears, they found it overflowing with an abundance of crabs of a myriad of species. Turning their attention to the beach surrounding them, jaws dropped and hearts skipped beats as they observed the beach seemingly overcome by legions of creatures. Without any intention, they'd stumbled onto a veritable gold mine, and all of the men on that boat that day swore a vow of silence to each other, keeping the location and its phenomena a secret until they'd made a sizable fortune, quickly becoming the most successful crabbing operation anywhere, and taking them all from average crabbers and fishermen to quite wealthy men, most of them anyway. As lucky as it all seemed to be, not everything was perfect. It seemed with the discovery of the bay, a dark omen seemed to follow, and in the weeks and years following, a few members of the crew would return to the bay alone and never return, seemingly disappearing into thin air. Only traces of one would ever be found, a shirt found floating just feet away from the shore, ominous, but ultimately inconclusive, and far from enough to prevent the rest from taking advantage of the land's gift. The rest of the crew, all of whom were richer now than they'd ever thought they'd be, go on to purchase the land, developing a strange affinity for the place, constructing the massive homes and manors that would become the neighborhood of Fiddler Grove around Crabbers Bay. Crabbers Bay is like most other private shores during most hours of the day. Quiet and calm, silted shores along the green borders of the forest, like any other Massachusetts shore. It's when the sun begins to dip, disappearing behind the sea line, and the sands and earth along the shore seem to shift in places with strange sentience. And the crevices and spaces between the rock formations on either side of the shore seem to teem, with tiny forms and hundreds of spindly legs pouring forth, that the place unveils its strange nature there. By the time my head had snapped in his direction, prompted by a shout, Ryan had already taken off in pursuit of something, kicking up a cloud of sand for me to run through in his wake. Shit, my eyes search ahead while running, settling on a fist-sized point of movement and color, purple and black like a bruise, reflecting the final rays of the setting sun, scuttling forth from a freshly opened hole dug out of the sand. A crab, purple marsh to be specific, had unveiled itself from its resting spot under the sand and began roaming the beach absent-mindedly. The first raindrop of a coming storm. Ryan had already covered more than half the distance to the thing, which seemed to realize it was being pursued, veering off to the left towards the little sand slopes, leading up to the forest land ahead, then quickly scuttling off to the right, repeating that pattern along the sand. My brother remained in pursuit, nearly losing his footing several times as the sand slid from beneath him, but eventually managing to close enough of the gap to leap forward and drop the bucket over the fleeing crustacean. "Gotcha, you speedy little jerk," he cried in frustrated triumph, raising the bucket and grabbing the crab in one swift motion, holding the creature under the armpits of both claws to prevent any pinching, as we'd done so many times before. I can't tell you why we did it, or what we found so entertaining about it, but it was sort of a tradition. Truly, I've spent years asking myself, damn near punishing myself for it solely for the events of that day. But ultimately, it seems like collecting small animals is just one of those things that little kids seem to do. Be it frogs from a nearby creek or fish in the local pond, there's something intrinsically exciting about catching and collecting little animals. Even more than that, it was tradition, and something my brother and I loved. Nothing was as rewarding as a kid as the excitement of tasting the fruits of our labor when we'd rush back to the deck with full buckets to excitedly show our parents. And Dad would find a good blue or Dungeness crab, fire up the boil, and we'd spend that night on the deck cracking shells and enjoying the fruit of our labor. Together, listening to waves along the shore as our father regaled us in some familiar tale his father had told him of Crabbers Bay. Ryan and I would take turns seeing who could fling their empty shells the furthest and standing there on the edge of the balcony, the gentle song of the water in the distance, eating our catch of the day. We like to imagine we felt just like our great-grandfather had when he was out on the sea. I win again, Ryan hooped, raising the purple and black-hued crustacean overhead like an Olympic medal before placing it in the plastic bucket he'd carried with him. "I hope we can eat this one. It's huge. This thing could feed the whole family with one leg." The creature seemed to wriggle its legs with a mechanical slowness in protest before it was deposited into the buckets dismissively. Yeah, whatever," I muttered dismissively at his victory, leaving his question unanswered. "Look, it's almost time. They're coming." Ryan followed my gaze to the tide rolling over the shore, the water seeming to ripple and shudder with movement and disturbance beneath the shore as the waves recede into the sea. Leaving the sand, which was usually clear save for the occasional dregs of seaweed, broken seashells and rocks that would wash ashore, was now littered with jagged shells and shapes from the deep. At first glance, it would appear that the tide had washed in a great heap of sea, trash, empty shells, rocks, and general ocean garbage. But the longer one looks, you'll quickly notice that the empty shells and rocks are making strange, jerky movements. They'll spot the myriad of spider-like appendages that extend from beneath them and watch as they scuttle away from the water with a speed and insectoid jiltedness, for a lack of a better word, in their movement pattern that's inherently disconcerting as they begin their ritual invasion of the beach. Quickly overwhelmed by their presence at the mouth of the bay, small fist-sized portions of mud and sand began to move, seemingly autonomously, at first pulsing slightly with some minor signs of disturbance, as though something was set to burst forth, the points of motion quickly growing more pronounced and obvious as small clawed pincers of various types emerged from the earth, shoveling away the mud and sand with a practiced quickness in a way that always reminded me of something out of a zombie movie. All around us, What appeared to be hundreds of small stones left by the tide shifted, the drift border of the water, depositing more and more of the little six-legged creatures on the beach in small clusters of mud and sand, parted to reveal all the Atlantic blue and purple marsh crabs that had embedded themselves into the earth around us. Come on, let's go. I've never seen some of these before. Ryan cried out, sprinting along the water, dancing around the occasional crustacean emerging from the wet ground. Bucket held out beside him to avoid swinging around its occupant. He stopped, kneeling beside a particularly large purple marsh, digging itself from its cover on a portion of the beach, usually dry, that was now affected by the rising waters of high tide. All six of its legs splayed out to either side, wriggling with a strange labored sort of motion, jerky and odd, as though it were mechanical or some poorly piloted marionette. My skin crawled and a shudder ran down my back. As interesting as I'd always found the creatures and enjoyed catching them, I could never shake just how alien and inhuman they looked up close. It was to be expected, though. My grandfather had always said the creatures were from another world, evolving to survive both on land and life in the darkest depths of the oceans, in conditions almost otherworldly comparatively, watching as the tiny pincer-like mouth of the crab splayed open and shut, its stalked eyes searching for escape. I could almost believe it was really from another world. Well, look at that one. Ryan dropped the purple marsh into the bucket and pointed a bit further down the shore at another crab, scurrying forth from the edge of the water. This one a fiddler, named such for their having one giant claw that dwarfs the other, like a man holding a fiddle. The poor thing seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if truly taking a second to take in its new environment on land, until quickly taking note of my brother's approach as he barreled down on it, and attempting to make a hasty retreat which was encumbered by the sheer size of its claw, which it had no choice but to drag at its side. All around us, the shore that had once appeared untouched from a distance was covered in the creatures as sand, and dirt shifting under every movement of hundreds of emerging shells and legs, scuttling forth from wherever they had emerged, crowding the beach like a flock of birds on their strange, inexplicable schedule. This was the phenomena of Crabber's Bay, the magic of the land, as my dad said our great-grandfather used to call it, the very reason for Fiddler Grove's existence, and the reason for the fortunes of the families who'd called it home, even for us having grown up in the city. Outsiders of community and ignorant to both the depths of their beliefs and the true nature of the phenomena, there was a strange sort of reverence in which you held the place, a feeling that there was something more at play there, a strange, otherworldly sort of atmosphere, reminiscent of the way one felt standing outside in those quiet hours before morning when the world adopts an uncanny silence. Perhaps it was a result of how silent the shore was, usually the canopy of the forest surrounding the bay, muffling any outside noise, leaving nothing but the sound of the waves most hours. Though when the sun began to set and the beach came alive with all the faint shuffling and movements of hundreds of moving legs, it grew to something of a strange natural cacophony, like the summer song of cicadas. The hunt was on. I wouldn't begin to realize it until the initial excitement of returning to the beach for the first time that year had stirred in me, drowning out my other senses, and faded that I felt it. Standing there, as my brother observed his most recent catch, another crab of unusual size, my ears seemed to perk inexplicably. The hair on my back rose along with it as I caught a glimpse of something farther along the shore of the bay. At the far end of the beach, where the shores of the inlet approached the forest, and sand began to give way to patches of grass again. I furrowed my brow, squinting in hopes of better viewing the notably large shape on the other end of the shore, something I was sure hadn't been there when we'd arrived on the beach. My heart skipped a beat for reasons I couldn't explain, something about seeing the unexpected shape sending a ripple of discomfort through me. At first I took what I saw to be a massive deposit of seaweed and other detritus of the sea, given its strange shape and color, perhaps washing up along with the crabs on the receding tide, as it wasn't unheard of to have some trash wash ashore from the various bodies of waters that emptied into the surrounding ocean. But even with that thought in my mind, the chill I felt almost as soon as I laid eyes on it seemed to linger stubbornly, my gaze brought back constantly to the dark shape at the far end of the beach. Ryan's excited chatter seemed to fade to background noise as he bucketed another crab, my focus on the strange, dark, amorphous shape at the end of the shore. I squinted as though to bring clarity to what I was seeing. Sure, I must be mistaken. It seemed to be moving, rising steadily in its place. A shock rippled through me at the utterly unexpected sight of strange, electrifying side effect of the utter surprise at watching something I thought to be inanimate rose with a strange steadiness of the immediate flood of explanations and expletives that tore through my mind. In that instant, I began to settle in on the idea that it must have been the wind blowing what had to be a massive tangle of seaweed wrapped around something. In a wave that almost appeared to make the mass seem alive, something in my mind unwilling to accept that the oddity at the end of the shore was anything to worry about, unwilling to be distracted from my brother and its fun on the beach. Yet the longer I looked, utterly unable to break my gaze from the unidentifiable mass, the greater the cold, eerie sensation in me began to grow like the swelling tide. And as it began its glacial approach, my belief in the wind theory was destroyed as quickly as it had been formed. "Ryan," I began, my voice breaking slightly, curiosity with an inexplicable hint of fear audible in my tone. "Yeah," he breathed, sand all over his hands and his left cheek as he turned to face me, one eyebrow raised, as if to ask why I wasn't digging through the sand with him. My stomach turned as the shape seemed to shuffle forward, its movement slow, methodical, and uneven. I could practically feel the gears turning in my head as my mind threw out suggestion after suggestion to identify just what I was seeing, all of which seemed to fall flat, only furthering the cold-feeling energies within me. Ryan picked up on the hesitancy in my response, his face shifting from excitement to a look of bewilderment and confusion, until he followed my gaze along the shore. His expression shifted quickly, utter confusion giving way to curiosity and bewilderment in an instant. "What the hell?" he muttered, rising to his feet, brushing off the remaining sand from his knees. "What is that?" His question made something drop within me, plummeting into a strange pit opening in my chest. Something about hearing what I was seeing confirmed, eerily disturbing. I nearly jumped out of my skin as I felt something brush along the top of my bare foot, then again against my legs, letting out a yelp of surprise as I leaped back, finding what felt like the one clear patch of sand in the area as I fell, narrowly avoiding stepping on the briny shell of a massive blue crab underfoot, just one of a slow but noticeable trail of crustaceans flowing towards the opposite side of the shore. From such a distance, the shape of the thing approaching was indiscernible, and my mind shot forth a myriad of suggestions, convinced of each for only the couple of seconds it took to realize it was false, shifting from a large dog somehow emerging from the water to a pile of sea debris carried strangely along with a breeze. None of the suggestions my mind threw forth seemed to stick, each theory as to what I was looking at having some glaring issue before settling on the only thing that made sense, though for whatever reason, it still felt off. "I think it's one of the neighbors. You know how weird they get around here," I offered, though I couldn't tell how much of that I believed, and the tremble in my voice signaled the doubt I felt. "Yeah," Ryan began, eyes narrowed as he watched the slowly approaching figure. "There are a lot of weirdos around here, but still, don't they usually avoid us?" I knew he was right. Call it another quirk of this place, but the community of Fiddler Grove has always been a rather insular one, likely a result of the days when the original fishers elected to keep it a secret, morphing into an odd insular attitude and apparent unwillingness to even socialize with outsiders, which I guess we were. They always seemed to watch us from a distance, an unreadable but surely unwelcoming expression on their face, as if they knew something we didn't. It was far from uncommon for us to catch sight of a neighbor eyeing my brother and me playing on the beach from their porch or balcony, a practically uniform frown carved into their expression, who would respond to our friendly waves by turning their backs and disappearing into their home. Now here we were, apparently watching one of those people shuffle towards us in such a way that made my skin crawl and raised my hairs on end. Whoever it was at the end of the beach, they were shambling closer. At that point, any doubt I had about whether or not what I was seeing was just some pile of seaweed or trash held together and swayed by the wind faded as with every second it continued its approach, moving with obvious intent. Let's just ignore them. If they say anything or stuff gets weird, we can go inside. The suggestion seemed to satisfy Ryan, who gave the thing a final sideways glance before shrugging and turning his attention to a fiddler crab who'd been moving to join the strange trail of crabs moving down the beach, giving chase as it broke away to avoid him. A cold chill ran down my back, and I could all but feel the person from the other end of the beach's approach, an uneasy guardedness welling up in me. As if any second, a hand would clasp my shoulder. That sensation grew until I could practically feel the clammy breath of someone at the back of my neck growing unbearable, until eventually I turned, my eyes looking back on whoever it was now halfway across the beach from us. A strong breeze rolled across the water and onto land, forcing me to shield my eyes from the sand it kicked up. I could see the fabric, whatever it was the person was wearing, appearing from this distance to be a cloak of some sort, with grass and seaweed and other plant life clung to it as it moved with the breeze, creating an even eerie phantom-like sort of appearance. There's something about someone making a slow approach towards you. That is deeply disturbing. Something about their feelings. No need to move with any sense of haste or secrecy, trudging forward, uncaring of whether or not they're seen. They can make you break into a cold sweat. I tried to return my attention to my brother in our crab catch, but the unshakable feeling of being watched and someone drawing ever closer was unshakable. And I found myself muttering half-hearted responses to my brother's questions as I continued peering down the beach. The person, as shaky as that description felt for what I was seeing, began to go from an unidentifiable shape in the distance and gain some recognizable form, making it possible to make out certain aspects of their body beneath that unshakably odd cloak. Though its shape was strange, the slightly recognizable figure of a human woman, by the look of it beneath all the strangely colored coverings, was beginning to become somewhat clear, at least from her lower half. Though there was something undeniably off about it that I couldn't quite place, something I felt must be so obvious yet managed to evade notice. There was one strange detail I noticed, as it was impossible to miss, and likely the reason I'd misidentified them as something else to begin with. A hunch caused by something large and unwieldy on their back, like a book bag beneath a cloak. Despite that, the slow drip of unease like water from a broken tap was growing more intense, the atmosphere on the beach seeming to shift, an odd surrealism hitting me as though I were walking in a dream. That sensation one gets typically followed by the question, is this really happening? As though my mind already knew something was deeply amiss. Ryan seemed to take notice of how distant I was, quickly putting two and two together, turning his attention back towards the figure growing nearer. They're still coming, huh? He asked, his brows furrowed. Looks like they're moving. It looks like they're limping or something. Andrew, maybe they're hurt and looking for help. Should we do something? He hesitated when asking the last part, and I could see that the strange shift in the atmosphere had gotten to him too, a hint of anxiety breaking through his usual mask of confidence. Still, the look in his eye was a familiar one. I'd seen it many times throughout our childhood, like just before he'd scaled the tallest tree in our neighborhood to retrieve the neighbor girl's cat after hearing her crying. He fell halfway through his descent while I was left to watch from the ground in horror, time seeming to slow as my brother approached the ground. He never dropped the cat, and though he broke his arm, he smiled at the hospital, proud of what he'd done. Ryan was always more than just a daredevil. He was a sweet kid who would help someone in need, regardless of how much his older brother's cowardly attempts to dissuade him or convince him of the dangers. Still, I think at that moment, even he knew better than to just approach the person despite his helpful nature. There was so much about what was unfolding beyond the usual weirdness of the beach to which we were accustomed. That was unshakably weird, teetering dangerously on the border of simply odd and intimidating. He stepped forward, then stopped. His motion stuttered as reluctance seemed to wash over him. The figure at the opposite end of the beach had yet to cease its glacial forward charge towards us, growing more defined, though little detail could be made out from beneath the cloak-like garment draped over it. And we began to hear a noise made faint by the distance between us. Over the faint murmur of the waves and whisper of the breeze, I could hear something breathing, quite labored by the sound of it, a rasping, desperate voice that sounded as though someone was struggling for air against failing lungs and intertwined with it. A haunting, pitchy wail, like an older woman in distress, sent an icy chill down my back despite the relative warmth of the day. "Ma'am," Ryan called inquisitively across the beach, his voice shaking uncharacteristically with a hint of the same unease I felt. My entire body cringed as Ryan's call shattered the silence. Every nerve of my body seemed to jolt in response, a light but steadily growing stream of dread trickling through my chest as we awaited some semblance of a response from the odd person who was undoubtedly making their way towards us. His words seemed to hang in the air. punctuated by the constant clacking of tiny chitinous legs darting over top shells as they scuttled over one another and through the sand, which, as I began to truly listen more, my hearing growing more sensitive as I strained to hear a response, a whispered greeting, or anything from the person approaching, I noticed for the first time how much louder and eerily uniform the sounds had become. For the first time since their appearance on the beach, I managed to pry my attention away from the disturbingly captivating figure in the cloak, feeling almost mesmerized by its strange sway, and began to notice something wrong with the crabs covering the beach. They'd all but ceased their typical behaviors. Instead, coming together in masses of legs and shells of varied size and appearance, forming shuddering dark masses, moving waves with hundreds of spindly legs and grasping claws that seemed to move. With a single mind, like some massive ant colony, even the perpetually skittish hermits, which typically avoided the larger, sometimes more aggressive crabs, were now neglecting their typical feverish digging of safety holes in the sand to join the others. It wasn't an isolated event either, and as I turned to observe the rest of the shore behind us, I saw the same strange sight repeating all along the beach. They swarmed and circled en masse, moving like a living whirlpool, a constant hail of chittering clicks audible as they stampede over one another in their strange guided frenzy. Something was wrong. Opening my mouth to speak proved useless at first, and it felt as though the air had been sucked out of the immediate vicinity, leaving me to produce only the smallest sounds of surprise, shock still robbing me of my functions. The swirling masses on the beach behind us were beginning to coalesce and grow, forming massive dark monoliths dotted with dull grays, greens, reds, various colors of shells from the countless species amongst the shifting form, which almost appeared as a single entity, moving in concert with such fluidity. If you've ever witnessed the mesmerizing murmuration of a flock of birds in the sky, swooping and shifting as they move amongst each other with perfect coordination, in total unison and harmony, almost creating the illusion of a shimmering effect amongst the living cloud of avians or the shoaling of a massive school of fish. When they form a single mass, shifting, morphing as one, occasionally splitting off into separate clouds, only to coalesce again with their awe-inspiring grace of nature, then you've got an idea of what I was seeing. Except on the ground, and with far less breathtaking beauty and more of that jerky robotic like insectoid sort of movement typical of the animals. "Excuse me, ma'am." My head snapped in Ryan's direction. The question spoke with far more alarm than previously, momentarily distracting me from what I was seeing. He backed up, drawing closer to me, and it was clear why the woman had gotten considerably closer in the time I'd been distracted, moving at a steady pace towards us, disturbing, confusing details growing more visible with her approach. The cloak she wore appeared to glisten at a distance, either wet or coated in some reflexive substance, reflecting the last vestiges of fading light piercing the horizon. And though it was growing darker, and I felt as though I surely must have been mistaken in what I was seeing, it appeared as though her drapings were composed entirely of some strange blend of seaweed, moss, and other plant life. Still sopping wet, covering all but the hand holding the strange shawl closed around her, and a portion of her head stooped forward as she walked. Her skin made my stomach turn, bearing a sickly, mottled gray appearance, reminiscent of a living corpse from a Romero film, and her head was the same, with a few clumps of long, sopping, wet black hair hanging from it. Filthy, cloudy water dripping from its ends. As the sun dipped below the horizon, its final rays reflected across the cool gray surface of the water and caught her ghastly figure, exposing yet another ardor that made my blood run cold all throughout her strange garment. Almost imperceivable due to natural camouflage, shells embedded like strange decorative gems. They were crabs. The thought that they were dead passed my mind momentarily, my frightened mind's loose attempt at rationalizing a clearly irrational situation. But the thought was dashed as I noticed the occasional rise of a claw or movement from a long, thin leg from the fabric, and I realized that somehow they were all alive and moving. The almost rhythmic sound of the shifting sand as she moved had nearly faded to background noise. But as she'd almost covered more than half the original distance between us, I began to wonder just what caused such a sound. A moan low and gravelly, as if coming from a voice that hadn't been used in years, rose above the sounds of the beach, barely audible above the steady crackle of the teeming legions of crabs behind us, thousands of legs and shells swarming over each other that made my skin crawl. Ryan's wide eyes met mine. Unspoken messages passed between us in an instant, both feeling the same primal terror, pleading desperately for us to run to get as far away from the present strangeness as possible. Still, something about that night, the strange, silky, dreamlike quality of it all, kept us in place for just a few moments longer. A thick, pungent odor filled the air, coating the inside of my nose. Sea salt and rot, and I swallowed against the ominous rumble in my stomach it caused. I took a step back away from the wave of stench rolling forth from the ghastly woman when a sharp pain exploded through my ankle, sending a wave of nausea rippling through me, and I fell to the ground with an ominous crunch. Shit, I cried out, pulling my legs close and gripping my now throbbing ankle. The pain was extreme, at least for a child like I'd been. It was so much pain that for a moment I didn't notice the strange consistency of the ground I was laying on. Parts of it hard and slippery and wet under my arms, while in other places jagged points seemed to dig painfully into my skin. It was a combination of the pain settling into reality, allowing my senses to return, and Ryan's horrified, stunned expression, as his eyes stared past me, glazed with fear as he saw what I'd landed on. "Andrew, are you okay? Get up." His voice was small and frightened in a way I'd never heard from him before, for the first time truly sounding like my frightened younger brother. He was clearly worried about my well-being, sensing that I was hurt, but I could tell that wasn't his focus. His eyes glazed as he stared past me. What I'd assumed to be the earth beneath me had shifted, practically moving me along with it. And his one hand shot away from my ankle in response, running along the hard shells and pointed claws of the swarm beneath me. Now a single moving wave of pinching claws and moving limbs completely covered the ground beneath me. Ryan's head shot back and forth, eyes darting between myself and the legion of crabs beneath me, and the woman who couldn't have been more than 30 feet away from us at that point, the stench wafting off of her growing, suffocating. The ground around our feet was covered within seconds by the impending mass now moving across the beach like a wave, and I managed to roll myself over the shells beneath me, finding a patch of open sand with the help of Ryan, who grabbed my arm, pulling me up onto my good leg. On the ground all around us, numerous crabs, some impossibly large, almost the size of small dogs, flowed past like a living river. The continuous prickle against my legs, making my entire skin itch, with the sensation of little legs crawling across me, reconvening past us, in a single stream moving for the same point. The woman, if we could even still call her that, was so close we could hear each one of her slow, labored breaths and the sickening gurgling sound her throat would emit with every attempt to inhale. Though still covered by her garment, the construction of which stumped me, as it seemed entirely composed of things I saw no way to fashion into clothing, seaweeds and various greenery stitching together reminiscent of some natural soup. Her visible arms seemed to dangle before her uselessly, and as she approached, even with the sun now firmly behind the horizon, I could see the sickly condition of her skin more clearly, and my mind raced with questions. It was the arm of a drowning victim out of a movie, or a waterlogged corpse pruned with the skin seemingly ready to slosh off the bone at any moment, hanging loose from the body. I couldn't imagine what the rest of her would look like, nor did I want to find out. The black mass of shells and legs moved toward her like a living river pooling around her. Individual crabs crawling up her form, their legs disappearing into the strange mossy coverings draped over her as they embed themselves like sick jewels. I don't know why I kept looking. Everything in me begged for me to turn my head or close my eyes, screaming out to me that whatever stood before us was something unexplainable and that I should be fleeing. Still, my legs felt frozen. My feet locked in place in the sand by some misfiring in my brain, eyes locked on the approaching figure, staring deep into the darkness beneath her cowl, horrified, yet waiting for whatever was concealed beneath. I couldn't have been prepared for what I was going to see. The sky had turned from the deep purple and orange of the twilight to the navy blue of the night. The moon hangs overhead, serving as a brilliant source of light, illuminating the beach below. As she shuffled forward, barely a few feet away from me at this point, the face concealed beneath her hood became visible. A morbid blend of humanity and something else I struggled to comprehend. Whatever this was, this thing we've been sharing the beach with, it wasn't human. Her face, above the nose anyways, was the most humanesque aspect of her appearance, with undeniably feminine eyes that would have been striking if not for their lacking any sort of white sphere-iris twin pools of wide inky blackness that seemed to pierce me with her gaze. That was the extent of the thing's humanity in her appearance, her nose merely two pulsating slits in her face at first glance, but a flash of motion from them caught my eye. Then a second and a sick feeling flooded through me as I began to process what I was seeing. Two little mandible-like things flitted out of her nose on occasion, seemingly tasting the air around her. The mouth was no better, almost imperceivable when shut. It splayed open as she hissed two separate sets of fleshy, pale pincers covered in what seemed like human skin, separated like parts of a mask to reveal a circular opening riddled with a mouthful of teeth protruding from all directions. A steady stream of saliva running down her chin, splaying across the sand as she began to emit strange, excited chitters. My mind reeled in a violent wave of dizziness. Struck with such force my vision seemed to shake from it, as the strange sense of surrealism of being in a waking nightmare grew overwhelming, rising up in my chest, threatening to make me vomit. Ryan tugged at my arm, returning my senses as he tried desperately to pull me in the direction of the deck. Terror etched into his features as I'd never seen before. I tried to follow, entirely forgetting the injury to my ankle, which gave way almost as soon as I placed my weight on it, sending me sprawling face first into the sand. I turned back to gauge the horrible woman's distance from us, regretting it immediately as I got my first view of what was hidden behind the strange cloak. For one, what looked like a cloak from a distance was actually a net, a standard fishing net entangled with a variety of ocean plant life, like some makeshift suit serving as home to a dozen small crabs that seemed to have made a home in the thing. I wanted to try to stand up again, to run or crawl, but I remained frozen in place, staring up at the approaching nightmare, waiting at any moment for myself to wake up. But there would be no jarring moment of shooting up from my bed, realizing it was all just a dream, and with each passing second, the horror I felt seemingly threatened to burst my heart. The thing was an abomination. The top of its head, by far the most human part of it, seems to rise up from out of some sort of pale shell around the top half of her body, peering out with those endless black eyes as though taking measure of May. Its torso was humanesque in shape, but not in design, covered in a clear yellowish carapace beneath which its fleshy insides were visible. A pulsating mess of pink and white with streaks of red blood vessels and covered with 6 long, fleshy tendrils, 2 of which ended in points, the other 4 of which ended in small, useless little hands that appeared malformed or incomplete, like something you'd find on a fetus with white muscle and bone visible under ripped skin that didn't seem to fit, all stabbing and prodding at the air in front of it, like a hermit crab trapped on its back. One of her arms ended in a human hand, the skin of which appeared ordinary, and the question of whether the thing before me had once been human did occur to me, but it was drowned out by my deafening fear. The other was claw-like, but clearly made up of fingers stretched or malformed to appear like a claw, with bony ridges running down the inside of the thumb and index. As my eyes traveled down the creature, every detail seemingly worse than the last. My stomach turned as I saw its legs, immediately understanding the strange limp in their gait. The thing had 4 crab-like stilts for legs, on which it teetered and moved like a marionette. The fleshy arms continued to shoot forward, reaching for me desperately, and the creature picked up speed, moving towards us with a quick, spastic, uneven motion that triggered every fight or flight response I had. Help. Help us, Ryan's desperate cries only served to make my heart beat faster. As I felt his hands grip under my armpits as I began to desperately attempt to pull myself towards our house, the thing hissed and chittered loudly in response, its body beginning to twitch violently as it shook off its strange fishing net garment, grasping it firmly in its human hand, revealing itself fully to us. It was like some horrible god had taken a woman, beautiful one, maybe at some point, and stitched her into a massive crab shell, replacing what should have been her back and shoulders, which I realized was the mass I'd seen on her back. There was something almost hauntingly beautiful about her eyes, and for some reason all that came to mind was the mental image of a mermaid with pixie-like dark eyes. And for a split second, I could afford to be distracted. I wondered if the creature before me had always been this. A faint, wet scratching noise came from the hole where her mouth should have been. Its mandibles splayed out to either side to reveal the hole full of jagged human teeth. It took me a moment to realize what was happening. She was speaking. Her voice was a horrid, raspy, sing-song whisper that made my blood freeze. Crack the shell, eat what's inside. Crack the shell, suck out the meat. Crack the shell, taste the sweet, tender, fleshy bits. The creature sang its spine-tingling tune to itself as it scuttled towards us. Globs of drool dripped from the ends of its mandibles, running down the exposed muscle and flesh of its neck and disappearing beneath its carapace, an undeniable hunger present in its expression. Crabs from every part of the beach seemed to take notice of the creature, seemingly attracted to it in droves crawling over my brother's feet and running along my entire body as he pulled me until a continuous swirling mass of legs and shells had formed beneath the creature, like some freak hurricane of which it stood in the eye. Its eyes, two wet, dark orbs on stalks, rose from the center of its face like snakes from a den, and I could feel them staring through me. An intense, horrible hunger seemed to roll off of it in waves. Crack the shell. Have a taste. It began to dawn on me that she wasn't talking about the crabs, and a split second spent wondering what she meant by shells practically set me afire with panic. It was going to eat us, or try anyway. This thing, this monster from the depths of some sick creator's mind, was going to devour my brother and me alive. The thought was dizzying, like staring over the edge of a skyscraper, but it provided all the motivation I needed to try and push myself up onto the one good leg, using Ryan as balance and trying to flee as best I could. Though the root of unease had grown into a forest of inescapable dread within me, knowing that she was closer to us than we were to the house and moving much faster, we weren't going to make it. We were going to die on this beach that we've loved all our lives at the hands of something I couldn't even understand. I knew I should turn away, to focus on the house ahead of me and put my every effort into escaping. But something in me refused, utterly, horrifically transfixed with the cause of my imminent demise. "Andrew, hurry, man," Ryan pleaded from ahead of me as I lagged behind, my injured ankle screaming out with a red-hot pain that radiated through my entire leg, pulsing like a heartbeat. He'd stopped running several feet ahead, staring back between myself and our pursuer with an unreadable expression. From behind me, I heard the awful croon of the thing groan nearer, along with the almost rhythmic sounds of its massive crab-like legs slamming into the earth as it scuttled forth. I tried to stand, and collapsed again into the sand beneath me, shouting out in pain and frustration as I'd never felt before as my leg gave up on me once again. "Just go. Please go get Mom and Dad," I cried out to him. My face fell into the sand, a dejectedness spreading through me like nothing I'd ever felt, as the fact of my imminent demise weighed on my young mind. I knew there was no way he could do that, no way for him to reach our parents and get back in time. But I wanted to protect him and get him as far away from the danger as possible. I just wanted him to live. But Ryan was always the brave one. The sound of continued footsteps in the sand brought a surge of relief, overwhelmed almost immediately by a shockwave of dread as I realized they were approaching. My head shot up and my heart fell as I confirmed what I'd heard. "No, go," I shouted at my brother, barreling towards me. Tears streamed down his face, yet his expression was one of rage and determination. "He's going to try and drag you back, and neither of you will make it." The thought almost killed me itself as I begged for my brother to turn back and to leave me. "You can't carry me fast enough. It'll get us both," I said. Ryan was strong, stronger than me at least. And like I said, he was a big kid. But even he wouldn't be able to drag me back faster when the horror behind us was approaching. Its sickening croon was almost sing-song now, though the voice was a horrid mix between a deep, wet gurgle and something reminiscent of a grandmother singing to her loved ones. My brother turned to me. I know he said his response was unusually firm, with a finality that made my blood run ice cold. "Get up and go as fast as you can," Ryan said, running past me. He ran towards the nightmare of a being that had emerged from Crabber's Bay. I heard someone call his name, a horrible, sorrowful shriek. I realized the voice was my own, as I watched him grow closer and closer to the ever-thrashing vestigial hands of the woman on their long, fleshy, crab-like arms, reaching out desperately for my brother. I can't imagine what he hoped to do. I suppose he thought he was going to grab the thing and overpower it, battling it heroically, leaving me the time to crawl to safety. Perhaps he thought he could even escape the thing, and we'd both make it back. Neither was the case. I watched on in horror as my younger brother came within reach of the longest of the creature's grasping arms. Time seemed to slow as it found hold of my brother, digging into the exposed flesh of his shoulder with a wet sound. Everything seemed to stop for a moment, as small drops of blood began to trickle down Ryan's back from where the creature's claws were dug in, leaving pale trails of red in their wake. Then, with the quickness of a striking spider, the rest of her limbs followed suit, all finding purchase in my brother's skin, the large clawed arm grasping his own with obvious brutality. A few of the thinner, more insectoid limbs reach around to plunge into his back, pulling him into something of an awful hug. The chitinous outer shell creaked with effort as the thing pulled him nearer. I opened my mouth, but found no words as she pulled him closer, an awful, excited moan rising from her as Ryan fought and struggled against her, taking up sand as he tried desperately to pull himself free. Stop. He began to plead. All the bravery once present in his voice was now gone. He sounded like the kid he was, just a scared 11-year-old. His pleas were cut short by another round of excited chittering from the creature as it raised its head, opening its mouth, gnashing hungrily with rows of human teeth. The mandibles extended out from either side of it, viscous drool running down their ends. She pulled Ryan into her, pressing him against her exposed chest, cold and hard where the shell covered it, seemingly wet and fleshy, where the strange human components remained exposed. By the steady streams of blood running down his arms and back, I could tell her grip was strong and only getting stronger. The pointed hooks and small prying fingers at the ends of her arms were deep in Ryan's flesh, making sure there was no way he was going to escape her grasp without leaving a significant chunk of himself behind. The being affixed my brother with a look. Her eyes, blazing with a hunger I couldn't comprehend before glaring over his shoulder at me. It's impossible to be sure with a mouth like that, but I swear she smiled at me before she spoke. Crack the shell. Taste the meat inside. Her voice was a whisper of death over the breeze, the only audible sound it seemed, besides the wind and water and non-stop clatter of crabs over each other, and her words rang with an audible finality. Then, with a final haunting shriek, she reared back and bit, her mandibles gripping him on either side of his head, pulling him close. The sounds in those following few moments have remained with me, haunting my thoughts like a phantom for years. I hear them ringing out from the darkness in my worst nightmares and awake in a frozen chill, with them echoing throughout my mind for hours to come. A sickening crunch rang out across the sand, starting a hurricane in my stomach as my lunch rushed up my throat, threatening resurgence, followed by an equally gruesome cracking squelch, like the sound of someone biting through a soft apple. Ryan, his body rather, began to convulse, a shower of red erupting from the center of his head as that damn thing reared its head back again, chewing noisily, its mandibles capturing and shoveling what loose bits of meat fell right back into its mouth. Its body shuddered with an undeniable pleasure, its beady eyes shutting for a moment in an alien expression of pure bliss, and its many arms clattering like teeth in the cold as it ate a part of him, a part of Ryan, on my little brother, right in front of me. The feeling of powerlessness that spread through me like a cancer hurt far greater than any physical pain I was in. I'd like to believe that it killed him instantly, saving him from whatever else it had in store for him. An injury like that should have been fatal. But the way he moved, the way he seemed to struggle against the vice grip that demon around him had, I don't know. Its grip never seemed to loosen. Quite the opposite, its spasm of excitement seemingly causing those awful little, almost human hands to dig in hungrily, disappearing into Ryan's back arms, and wherever else they'd made contact, as if merging with him. My sight grew blurry almost instantly. Maybe it was the tears, maybe it was the dizziness. Probably both. I tried to crawl forward, any concerns for my own pain, safety, or survival, turning to dust with the sight of Ryan, my only thoughts of getting to him, of reaching my little brother and holding him, of making everything okay. It seemed aware of my intentions, scuttling back away from me, dragging his feet in the sand, leaving a trail from the pool of blood beneath where he'd been that was quickly swarmed by some of the crabs who seemed to fight over it, and whatever else fell uneaten by the creature. I don't know how far I made it when my vision began to go. Hordes of darkness burning their way into the picture like damaged movie film, growing until the dark was almost all I could see. The world around me, and the scene in front of me, disappearing into an ever-shrinking pinprick as my subconscious waned. No. My tongue seemed almost as heavy as my eyelids, and speech felt impossible as I attempted to protest the inevitable. It was taking him. This thing was taking my brother away. It was every stranger danger scenario I'd feared as an older brother growing up, merged with something from my most depraved nightmare, and the panic seemed to sear my mind beyond sensibility. The fact that Ryan was almost assuredly dead seemed to constantly escape me, motivating my pathetic crawl forward, growing slower and more labored. As the world around me began to fade into shades of black, the thing scuttled back towards the shoreline, moving with its awkward gait as its useless human leg dangled between the massive crab legs carrying it, dragging Ryan along with it. It was strange, the coolness that seemed to flood through my body as it began to part from consciousness, and when combined with the feeling of the water against my fingers as I reached the edge of the shore, I almost felt as though I was floating. I raised my head with what strength I had left. My eyes struggled to adjust against the now darkened sky, with only the faintest rays of moonlight piercing the cloud cover to illuminate the night. It stood there, with its back to the moon, uproarious winds whipping the strange cloak of living things that had covered her off to the side. And she stood tall, arms outstretched in something that seemed like a show of dominance. Her stilt-like legs carried her several feet above the waves as the legions of crabs across the beach seemed to pour into the water after her in a massive tidal wave of movement. As the world around me began to fade into a pinprick, I watched. As the creature began to wade off from the shallows of the bay, a beach full of crabs around it followed suit, disappearing one by one beneath the water, which seemed an inky black mess in the darkness. She was the last to be submerged, a measured carefulness in her descent, casting a final look back at me and the surrounding shores. An unreadable glint present in those black eyes as they disappeared beneath the water, and the darkness seemed to envelop me. The following hours were excruciating. My father found me, passed out on the beach at the edge of the water while the tide was rising, and seeing no sight of my brother, he knew immediately that something was wrong. I'd nearly drowned. Hell, as the night continued, I wished I had. I told him everything I knew, everything that happened from start to finish, my brother and I seeing something strange at the moving end of the beach and thinking it must be a neighbor, all the way to the strange behavior of the crabs and how they seemed to respond to the thing. I suppose I don't have to tell you how well that went. Grief is a powerful, awful thing. It can warp the way you think, crack the lenses through which you view the world, and utterly transform a person. It certainly did for my father. I don't think he truly believed I had anything to do with Ryan's disappearance. We were best friends, and a part of me has to believe my father knows I never hurt him, that he was just a grieving father beyond his wits' end, and I was the only one on a beach where my brother's blood was found. By the time the police had come, he grilled me past the point of tears himself, and had to be calmed down by my equally bereaved mother, and I recall believing I was going to go to jail myself for my own brother's death at the hands of something unexplainable when the cops came. There were two of them, a woman stern and matter-of-fact, with her questions despite my obviously emotional state, and a man a bit taller, with a rather bushy mustache and a curious expression in his eyes that seemed to be searching for something. The woman cop had left the room to meet an approaching car of incoming officers and show them to the beach, where my brother's blood still sat. The place we played at for years, now a crime scene. When the room was empty, save for our family and himself, he spoke up, confirming what the expression on his face gave away. There was something he'd wanted to say since arriving. "Excuse my partner. She's not from around here, just transferred in. Look, I'm truly sorry, and we're going to do the best we can to find your boy." The officer had told my father after they'd arrived and been filled in on the situation, as well as my account of the events. But while I imagine this is a weird place, Crabbers Bay. Most folks that aren't from here or haven't been here for a long time don't come around here, and especially don't go near that beach. I know, my father began, his voice dripping with venomous grief I'd never heard from him before, which made me shrink away. The crab thing freaks most people out, and the people here are just as weird. Believe me, I've heard it from my wife enough. What has that got to do with the fact that my son is missing? The officer sighed, shooting a look at the partner who'd arrived with him to make sure he wasn't listening too closely. "Look, I shouldn't be saying any of this, but you lost your son, and I feel you've got a right to know about the history of this place. If this comes across as disrespectful, I'm sorry, but this isn't the first time a call like this has happened. I grew up 20 minutes out from here, and there have been stories about this place for as long as I can remember. It's not just the crab thing. People go missing sometimes on that beach and are never seen or heard from again. It's happened for as long as that first group of crabbers settled here. You get local kids going to visit the weird crab beach in that creepy rich neighborhood, only for one of them to never return. And the ones who did come back, well, they came back with stories. Wild, impossible stories about things coming from that stretch of shore. The officer adjusted his belt and shook his head as though trying to knock loose an unwelcome old memory. My old man used to blame it on the first people to move there. He used to say they made a pact with something dark. That something, I don't know, gives birth to all those damn things, or makes that place like that. That they must have agreed to let it take from them, just as they took from it, or just accepted the consequences. He paused for a moment, seeming to consider what he was saying. I don't know. It's all just ghost stories, and this state is full of them. But if I were you, I'd want to know. I can't say for sure what happened to your son, and like I said, I know we'll do our best to find him, but don't be too hard on your son there, he said, casting a glance at me. There may be something to that story of his. We never returned to that house. And despite my parents' best efforts and constant fruitless attempts at gathering a rescue party of the unwilling neighbors to go search for him, Ryan, where his body was never recovered, I've been content to try and handle this trauma as best I can over these years, doing my best to forget that place and come to terms with my brother's demise in a way that didn't make me feel insane. That was until recently, when a headline caught my eye while scrolling Facebook, shared by a family friend who'd grown up in one of those towns near Fiddler Grove, that sent my heart plummeting into familiar depths. Divers discover human remains in a hidden underwater cave system with the infamous Crabber's Bay. The article was short, and I finished it in minutes, a strange sensation, as though the weight of gravity had changed around me, flooding through me in those moments. It was a short piece, but it left a weight like nothing I'd read before. The disappearance of a 14-year-old from a small coastal town had become a frenzy in the local news after he and his friends planned a beach day on the shores of a rather infamous local beach. It was the last time anyone ever saw him, and each of the boys who'd been with him returned with similar stories, all of which shared key details that made the whole thing seem quite suspicious. The Coast Guard was brought in soon after, and a team of divers was dispatched to scour the bay for signs of a body. What they discovered instead was an intricate system of caves carved directly beneath the shores of Crabber's Bay. Caves that, if they didn't know better, almost seemed intelligently designed. Within these strange tunnels beneath the shore, the divers found the human remains, the scattered skulls and broken bones of several bodies, some of which dated back for several years. Most disturbing of all was the fact that many of the skulls appeared cracked from blunt force trauma and had come to serve as impromptu homes for some of the shell-seeking species of crab found on that anomalous beach, morbid shells made from repurposed humans. I felt something in me for the first time in years as I processed what I was reading. What it must mean about that place. I wondered if my brother's remains were among those found, serving as little more than a boneyard for sea insects to build homes in. That thought hurts more than I think I care to express in this story. At least now I know I'm not crazy. Sometimes when sleep gives way to nightmares and I sink into the darkest depths of my mind, I can still hear that awful crooning voice mocking me and that stomach-wrenching crack like a shell being broken, as if those sounds are burned forever into my psyche on those nights. I dream of a cloaked woman and the brother I couldn't save. I wasn't the best-behaved child a parent could hope for. I was selfish, greedy, and hostile. Basic nightmare kid. I'd pitch fits when I didn't get my way, and often make sure to break something my folks treasured to make my point. I would pound on walls, throw things across the room, and even slap or hit my mother or father when they would feebly attempt to calm me down. My dad had apparently been abused by his father when he was a kid, so he would always try his best to keep his cool when I raged on. I took advantage of that fact and made sure to push every single button I could to practically dare him to hit me. Many times he would just walk away and leave me screaming and raging, but I considered that a win. Oh yes, I was far more than a handful, but my parents still loved me, even if I was a monster in the making. It wasn't until that Christmas Eve of 2001 that I learned I was not the center of the universe, a lesson I most definitely needed to learn. It was during the family gathering on that day before Christmas that I pitched a legendary fit upon learning the supposed truth about the reality of Santa Claus. I was only 10 years old, and were it not for the kind hearts of my folks, I would have spent every single one of those years on the naughty list. That late November threatened to turn even those who still cared for me off the deep end. Everyone had arrived at our house for the festive meal, and my cousin Courtney had been pushing my buttons all day. She was a good 3 years older than me, and thought she knew everything that the world had to offer. Being far more experienced and knowledgeable than I, She assured me there was no such person as Father Christmas, a truth I was not ready to hear. She kept pushing and pushing as the day progressed, and I finally just lost it. We were up on the second floor of my childhood home, where my bedroom was located. Over the course of my raging tantrum, I pushed her out of my safe space with every ounce of strength my little arms could muster. Even after I got her out of my door, I continued thrusting my palms into her back, paying no attention to what lay ahead. She had already started crying before I gave that final jab that sent her rolling down the stairs. She tumbled against the wall and the railing as her arms flailed and head bounced from one step to the next. The snapping sounds and muffled yells ended with a thud when she hit the floor below. Every adult had made it out there before her fall came to a close, and their shocked and appalled eyes cut from her twisted body to my guilty face. I performed some awful acts during my short lifespan before that day, but my parents had always attempted to cure my terrible ways with kindness. This would mark the end of such times. Before the ambulance arrived, my father snatched me by the ear and dragged me into my bedroom. He screamed at me in a way I didn't realize he was capable of. I was crying my eyes out while begging for forgiveness, but he wouldn't let up. He wanted me to cry, and he was right. I deserved this and worse. His anger grew more intense with every word until he raised a hand up to strike me. It wasn't until then that his own rage faltered. He just stared at his own hand for a moment before he dropped it exhaustedly back to his side. He glared back at me, and I watched the scowl on his face lighten back to a more blank expression, with tears slowly dripping from his eyes. He shook his head from side to side and turned to leave the room without so much as looking back at me before he slammed the door shut. I would not see him again for the remainder of the day. The house fell silent after the paramedics left, with Courtney strapped to the gurney. I watched out my window to see everyone, including my parents, leave the house to follow the ambulance to the hospital. I was never left alone at home, but clearly nobody could stand to be around me at that moment. Truth be told, I didn't much care to be around myself at the time. The hours dragged by while I sat alone in my bedroom. Surrounded by all of the toys and video games my behavior had never earned me. Regardless of my short life, having included an almost endless supply of tantrums and violent mood swings when I didn't get my way, I never really felt bad about the misery I wrought. I generally only cared that I got what I wanted by the time I was done. This time, however, I did not feel any level of joy from this. I tried to defend myself in the back of my mind, reasoning that it was completely the fault of my older cousin for pushing my buttons, but I knew she didn't deserve this. Perhaps if she hadn't gotten in my face, I wouldn't have snapped like I had, but her actions didn't warrant what I did. Maybe she just ended up with a couple of bruises, and it's not as bad as it sounded. I reasoned with myself, though I could still hear the snapping of her bones ringing in the background of my silent, darkened room. No matter how hard I worked to evade the guilt that was in pursuit, I could not escape it. I can't say I'd ever felt like this before. Even when I broke the big screen television my father took such pride in, I didn't feel bad. Regardless of my inadvertently setting fire to the curtains in the living room, which very possibly could have burnt the entire house down if my mother's reflexes hadn't been so quick, my conscience still felt clear. There was no getting away from this one, no matter how much inner arguing I performed. Courtney could be dead, for all I knew, and her blood would be on my hands for hours. I just sat there in silence, perched on the floor of my room. Even after the sun retreated for the night, I didn't move from that same spot. I could have gotten to my feet to at least turn a light on, but I wanted to be in the dark. Any light could run the risk of me seeing my reflection in the window or something. I couldn't look into my own eyes right now. While my brooding continued and the world outside fell still, I became aware of a slight rumbling. It felt as though the whole house had begun to tremble slightly. The sensation was growing more and more intense by the second, finally inspiring me to break myself free from the carpeted floor for the first time in hours. I ran to my window to look outside after light appeared to beam through, almost as if the sun had shot back up from its dormant state. I could barely believe what I saw while I pressed my nose to the glass. My childhood home was on a very average suburban ST. Most of the houses sported similar designs with not much variation in color palettes. A two-lane road with houses on either side of it, just like millions of other neighborhoods across the country. Said road had now been replaced by a train track, with a long and somewhat ancient-looking steam train parked upon it. The smoke billowed from the wide chimney on the front, lining the street in an almost unnatural fog. As I stared at this unusual sight, I saw a man in a conductor uniform exiting the train. As soon as he set his foot on the snowy ground, he glanced up to meet my gaze. I quickly ducked down beneath the window, but I could still feel the eyes on me. I lifted my head up to look down at the man once more, to find he was still glaring at me. He had a kind face, with a wide smile and bright eyes. He raised his hand and gestured for me to come outside. Though I was more than a little freaked out, something inside me was almost begging to march out into the cold to see this up close and personal. I grabbed my thickest winter coat, scarf, and boots, and I ran down the stairs without looking back. I threw the front door to my home wide open, and I just stood there staring out. I pulled the knit cap from my coat pocket and pulled it snugly onto my head, while conductor still smiled on, waving his arm to beckon me forward. I stepped out into the thick snow on the ground, while swinging the door shut behind me. The wide-eyed and grinning expression of the man did not falter while I took wide steps, crushing the snow beneath my boot. "You ready, lad?" the man asked in a deep voice. "Ready for what?" I asked, craning my neck to look into the man's eyes. He was much taller up close than I'd expected when I watched him from my second-floor window. He appeared to be straining a little while bending his head down to look back at me. "To go to the North Pole, of course," he replied. "You're not serious." I scoffed. "Do you doubt your own eyes, child?" he asked, holding his arms out, as if to present the train to me, like I hadn't noticed it. The man's expression had still not wavered, even a little. His bright green eyes were so wide that they almost appeared to not be cupped on top and bottom with any eyelids, just perfectly round circles with small pupils in the center. His perfectly aligned and sparkling white teeth looked almost false and slightly cartoony. Though the face as a whole seemed unthreatening, I became more and more uncomfortable the longer I stared up at it. "I don't think I should," I replied, shaking my head softly. He just glared down at me with those cue balls for eyes and sheeplet teeth, neither blinking nor moving in the slightest. I felt my back tense up, and I was unsure if it was due to the frigid cold or the gaze of the stranger in the dark red train conductor's uniform. I started to back away from the man whose brow had begun to sink a little, forming a crease above the large and somehow darkening eyes. They'd been a light green before, but as I stepped away from him, they appeared to have grown a much deeper shade bordering on black. "I think I'm going to go back inside now," I said as I continued to back away. We continued our staring contest as I waved my hands around behind my back, hoping to feel my front door approaching soon. The second I felt my fingertips make contact with the reflective brass doorknob, the conductor outstretched his own arm in front of him, still maintaining his unsettling gaze. As I turned the knob, the white-gloved hand shot towards me, growing as it drew closer until the elongated fingers wrapped themselves around my entire torso. The grip was so tight it almost squeezed the breath right out of my lungs before it rapidly yanked me back to the man. Before I knew it, he was holding me right in front of his face. His unblinking eyes appeared almost the size of my head while he examined my face. "You will be boarding this train, young man." His foul breath hit me like a truck, causing me to cough and gag at the stench. "Would you care to climb the steps of your own volition, or shall I carry you like this?" His eyes looked as though they were pulsing while they glared into mine. The horrendous odor that spilled from his mouth still lingered in my nostrils, but that wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as his stare. I'll walk," I stuttered in little more than a whisper. The man nodded his head as he gently placed me back onto the ground. My shaky legs threatened to drop me to the concrete, and I briefly considered attempting to flee again. Somehow, I knew there'd be little point in that. I would be boarding this train whether I liked it or not. The choice was no longer in my hands, if it had ever been in the first place. The lanky conductor lowered his body into a bow while he gestured towards the open door that stood just above the 4 metal steps. My whole body was trembling while I approached, and then climbed up into the cab. There was an aged and musty smell that spilled from inside as I crossed through the precipice with a tall, slender man pulling himself up behind me. "Take any seat you like," he said as we paced through into the passenger car. I glanced around the carriage to see only a handful of other children perched upon the seats of the elegant yet somewhat eerie room. They all turned to look at me when I entered, and they all wore the same exhausted and timidly fearful expressions. There was a short-haired blonde kid with large circular lens glasses, wearing striped pajamas and a dark green robe. He appeared to be around 12 or so, if I had to guess. An African-American girl with long braided pigtails, who looked to be about the same age as I. Dressed in a uniform nightgown and a thick white coat with a fur-lined collar, a little red-haired girl in a puffy pink coat sat next to a ginger boy who looked maybe a year or two older than her. I presumed them to be siblings. He wore a long hooded blue coat and appeared to be bordering on tears while he glared back at me. The cabin itself was quite large, far bigger on the inside than I would have thought when I looked on from my bedroom window. The ceiling was maybe 15 feet high, with 3 golden and ornate chandeliers hanging from it. They each held several flickering candles, though they provided little light to the darkly lit cabin. Shimmering yet slightly tattered tinsel drooped from them, in no particular pattern or design. Each red velvet-lined row of seats had a large arched window to the side with delicate filigree of borders. The carpeted floor was the same color as the chairs, but was lined in yellows and greens, which speckled with a variety of muddy stains. Still, as classy as the place looked, there was something about it that felt ancient and ghostly. This seemed like a place in which the dead would gather to travel from one plane to the next, not one that would carry small and terrified children to the wonders of Santa's workshop. As my trembling legs led me to the closest seat, I had little doubt that we were not bound for any place fantastical and inspiring. Given the fact I'd very possibly killed my older cousin, the journey was not to reward me. The sour expressions etched onto the faces of my traveling companions led me to believe we were all on the same page. We would be facing punishment for our ill deeds tonight, something I could not deny that I deserved. We all sat in silence while the tall, thin man made his way to the front of the cabin before sliding the door open and leaving our sight. Occasionally, one kid would glance at another before cutting their eyes back to the world that was now swiftly moving beside us. The train made little noise as it traversed the tracks that seemed invisible to the occasional bystander or driver behind the wheel of one car or another. It felt like we would just pass, right through any obstacle that may drift in front of the speeding rail car, as though we existed now in a separate plane. I briefly considered the notion that I had died and was now being transported to whatever realm awaited me in the afterlife, but it was more of a fleeting thought, mixed with a grain of denial. As I stared out of the window to see the row of houses give way to a snowy and empty expanse, I became aware of the sweat that had begun to drip from my brow. I realized it was almost suffocatingly hot in here, and I thought it may be best to remove my thick winter coat. As I leaned forward to slide the padded fabric down my shoulders, the cute little pigtailed girl across from me cleared her throat loudly to catch my attention. She shook her head violently and whispered, "Don't." "Why not?" I asked. "It's so hot here." "Shoo." One of the gingers echoed from up front. "What?" I asked, darting my eyes between the other occupants of a train car. "Shoo." Came from all directions now, and the girl across from me still shook her head wildly as I continued to pull off my coat. "You guys are being dumb," I said, shaking my own head, pulling my left arm free from my jacket. Suddenly, the door at the front slid to the side, revealing the still smiling face of the conductor behind it. Instantly, all the other children turned their gaze away from me to look down at their own laps or out of the windows. I sat in place, with my right arm still in my coat, staring at the tall man as he strolled in wide strides towards me. He stopped once he got next to the seat I sat in before turning to face me with his head tilted to one side. We just stared at each other for a moment before he said, "Here we only have one rule." I felt my heart begin to race while the wide, round eyes darkened once more. Never, ever let them cool. I slowly pulled my coat back up my left arm and pulled it shut in front of me. As I continued my staring contest with the grinning man, he held his right hand up beside his face, snapping his fingers. Seconds later, another man came speeding through the door, pushing a cart which held a tall pitcher and a single filthy mug. It took me a second to notice that the one who pushed the tray appeared to have absolutely no features upon his face. It was like a blank sheet of flesh with two small holes for eyes. No mouth, no nose, no ears. The stained green and white striped shirt he wore hung to his knees, with eerily thin, pale legs protruding from beneath. I only refer to him as, well, him, because the proportions and mannerisms were somewhat masculine. Otherwise, there was little way of telling what he actually was. The blank-faced man stopped with a cart right beside the conductor, who reached for the pitcher with his eyes still fixed on me. He poured dark and steaming liquid into the cup without spilling a single drop. Despite his gaze not shifting from mine, he laid the pitcher down and snapped up the cup, holding it out towards me. I reached up with my trembling hand and grabbed the mug, expecting it to burn my fingers, but it surprisingly didn't even feel warm. Drink. I raised the cup to my mouth and instantly recoiled when the steam billowing from the fluid within felt as though it would burn my upper lip. It's too hot. I whined, lowering the cup back down. One rule. But I tensed up from head to toe while tears began to stream down my face. There was no way I could pour this scalding drink into my mouth. I knew it would burn me from the inside out. The slender arms reached out to me again, one wrapping its thin fingers around a hand which held a mug, and the other clutching onto the top of my head. He forced the cup up to my mouth while pulling my head backwards. Never. The rim hit my lower lip, immediately and excruciatingly fusing the tender skin with the ceramic. Never. The thumb of the hand which gripped my head tightly extended and lowered to push my bottom jaw open. Let them. I was struggling to break free from his grasp, and though he only held me by the head and hand, I could barely move my body. Cool. He tipped the bubbling beverage into my open mouth. Spilling the burning liquid across the skin of my face as much as down my throat, I screamed out, horrified by the immense pain I'd never before imagined. I felt blisters form on the outside of my mouth as well as the inside of my gaping orifice. It was like fire was erupting from within me, as though it were melting my insides, tearing holes in the inner lining of my esophagus and stomach. My flesh bubbled and popped, while my guts churned against the unbearable suffering. As the final drops fell from the cup into my gullet, I felt the dark fluid begin to leak from holes it had formed in my neck and torso. I was only vaguely aware of the hand, as it let go of my head and hand, while I coughed up thick blood onto my coat. As the conductor gingerly placed the mug back onto the rolling trolley, after tearing it away from the lip which had bonded to it, he ushered the blank-faced man out of the room. My body was spasming and twitching, while the holes in my flesh sealed themselves back shut. The bubbling skin on my face became still and soft once more, and the horrendous agony subsided. I turned to face the tall man again, to see him studying me, tilting his head from side to side like a curious dog. I just stared back at him, still trembling from the shock of the events that had just transpired. He turned on the spot before walking to the front of the cabin and out the door, sliding it shut behind him. Though my wounds had all closed, and my flesh showed no signs of the torment it had just suffered, my clothes were still damp from the liquid which had poured inside and through me. I had never felt more pain than the occasional scraped knee or elbow before this day. Perhaps some bruises from a fall from my clumsy twin left feet from time to time, but nothing even close to what I just experienced. I was still shaking all over, and none of the other kids would even acknowledge me. They tried to warn me. I couldn't deny that. Had they already experienced this themselves, I wondered, how long had the others been on board this train before I arrived? Would any of us ever escape this wretched thing? My head was in chaos as I turned to face the window again, to watch the world beyond these walls travel rapidly away as we thundered forwards. There had to be a way out, even if it meant leaping from the train and onto the snowy ground outside. Perhaps it would be thick enough to break my fall. I'm sure I wouldn't make it unscathed, but what hell awaited us if we reached our destination? I had to try to communicate with my cellmate, so to speak. I can't say that I was in a rush to break any more rules, but according to the conductor, they only had one. Snow-covered fields were all that surrounded the speeding train as I gazed through the glass, which was heavily frosted on the outside. My body was still trembling, though it was still inseparably hot in the train car I shared with the other silent children. Every now and then, I could swear I saw movement within the white mounds of earth outside. Though it was dark out there, the full moon shone down through a cloudless sky, which may have just been causing me to see things as we sped past the landscape on the other side of the window. Regardless of how peaceful, yet strangely unsettling, my surroundings appeared, I was terrified of what awaited us when the train reached its destination. With the torment I'd already endured, surely what was still to come would be far worse. I felt my eyes welling up again, as the hopelessness of it all struck me like a hammer to the jaw. I bowed my head, whispering prayers under my breath, to make it through this in one piece. I had been an awful and conniving little brat my whole life, all 10 years of it. Perhaps I had no right to ask for forgiveness for the awful things I'd done, only hours before I found myself on this journey to hell. Hey, I heard a whispered voice call from my left. I turned to see the little girl across the aisle smiling at me. Hi, I replied softly. I meant to speak a little louder, but it seemed I was no longer capable of anything more than a whisper. Maybe I'd sustained some lasting damage after all. She smiled at me, with something remorseful in her eyes. It was as if she felt guilty for what I'd just endured, but even as much of a shitty human being as I was, I knew she tried to help me. I was just too damn pig-headed to listen. I'm so sorry you had to go through that. She cut her stare away from me as she spoke, with a slight crack in her voice. It's not your fault, I said, attempting to smile as much as I was able. We just stared at each other for a moment. She was a pretty girl with beautiful big brown eyes. She looked very tired, though I couldn't tell if it was exhaustion from this experience or just the fact that it was some time after midnight by this point. I was still very young and hadn't really taken the time to appreciate the opposite sex just yet, but I found myself quite taken with her, which caused my face to flush and cut my eyes away from her in embarrassment. I'm Zafi, she whispered. I couldn't tell if she was keeping her voice low in hopes of avoiding alerting our host, or if she may have been forced to ingest the acid-like concoction herself. I'm Mikey, I replied, still feeling incredibly shy. Will you shut the hell up? The boy in the round glasses called out. You're gonna get us all in trouble if you don't stop. His neck was craned around the edge of his seat to look at me, and his brow formed a scowl, not unlike the one my father had shown me earlier that day. It mildly annoyed me that he was seemingly only directing his rage at me when I was not alone in the conversation I was having, but I could still understand where he was coming from. God knows what the other members of this small group had gone through before I boarded. I just nodded at the angry kid before giving Zafi a guilty smile and a shrug. The boy turned back to face away from me again, while I still gazed at the little girl on the seat beside mine. We locked eyes for a few moments, and I was surprised the experience didn't make me feel more uncomfortable. There was something peaceful about her, which helped my scattered mind regain a more composed state. That was, however, before the door slid open again. Tickets, please, the conductor said as he strolled up to the red-haired kids up front. I don't have a ticket, sir, the boy replied, stammering to get the words out. Oh, I beg to differ, young man, the tall man said as he snatched the right hand of a child up. The boy yelped when the man whipped a large ticket puncher out of his pocket. In one quick motion, he slid the kid's hand into the device and punched a hole right through the center of his palm. He cried out in pain as blood spurted from the wound onto his shirt and tears spilled down his face. A little girl beside him tried to struggle against the thin man in the dark red suit when he wrapped his long fingers around her wrist, but he was far stronger than she was. As much as she fought to pull her hand away from him, he still managed to poke a fresh hole into her flesh, just as he had her brother. I tensed up and began hyperventilating as I watched the blood trickle onto the carpet while the conductor made his way to the kid with the round glasses, leaving the two still sobbing behind him. Another scream echoed through the cabin after the third ticket was punched, and I found myself shaking violently as the man paced back towards me. Ticket, please. Still reeling from the burning liquid being forced down my gullet, I knew it would be a terrible idea to refuse the man's demands, so I offered my trembling hand, while biting down and preparing for what was to come. If nothing else, it was quick. Truth be told, pain wasn't nearly as bad as I expected. I still screamed out, but it wasn't from the pain as much as the sound of the metal prong chewing through my tissue. I can't say I'd ever seen that much blood pour out of me before, though. Sure, the holes which had only recently formed in my throat and gut mixed scarlet streams with a brown liquid as it oozed out from within me. But this was just thick, dark crimson that leaked from me now. It didn't stop flowing as quickly as my previous injuries either. The conductor still glared at me while I cupped my gushing right hand in my left. He almost appeared disappointed that I wasn't making as much of a fuss as the other kids, who still whined and sobbed. I turned my gaze to meet the little girl across the aisle, trying to mentally signify to her that it wasn't all that bad. Strangely, she showed no signs of fear or apprehension. She just smiled back at me with something in her eyes I couldn't quite decipher. "What are you looking at, child?" the grinning man asked, before I cut my eyes back to meet his. I replied, quite confused by the question, as I found it quite obvious who I was looking at. "What are you looking at?" There was an impatience to his voice, regardless of the fact that he spoke almost mockingly slowly. Before I could finish my reply, he swatted the back of his hand at the side of my face. This hurt considerably, more than a hole in my hand, though I could not tell if my spinning head was due to the impact or the blood loss, as my palm still oozed onto my pants. "The girl," I replied, with tears streaming down my swelling face. For the first time, I watched the wide smile falter. The conductor's expression appeared to melt into an almost human form before he turned slowly to face the girl sitting across from me. He stood staring at her for what felt like minutes before he quickly turned on the spot and sped back through the door at the front of the cabin. When the door slammed shut, I looked back over at the cute little girl who quickly cut her eyes away from me. "What just happened?" I asked, truly mind-boggled over the fact that the man appeared to not even know she was there. "That's, complicated," she replied with a shrug. "How come?" I asked. Nothing had made any sort of sense since this whole nightmare began, but this was something I couldn't even begin to wrap my head around. "Well," she said, still refusing to allow our eyes to meet. "The thing is, she was cut off by the door sliding open, with a conductor practically sprinting through it towards us." I pressed my back against the window, bracing myself for whatever was about to happen, while the little girl jumped out of her seat and into the aisle. She just glared at the man with her hands balled into fists as he charged at her. His movements were fast, so much faster than my eyes could even register. In an instant, he tackled the girl, rolled onto the floor, and backed up onto his feet with his arms wrapped around her. She was struggling against him, but he held her far too tightly as he headed out the door behind where I sat, slamming it closed behind him. We all stared at the sealed door, with our collective mouths hanging slack and wide. The kids at the front of the car were murmuring back and forth, clearly attempting to puzzle together what had just transpired. Before I was even aware of what I was doing, I took off towards the back door. As I pulled it open and headed through, I heard the other kids yelling at me to come back, but I felt suddenly filled with more purpose than I ever knew myself to be capable. I charged through the door of the next train car, then the following one, still finding no trace of the two who had passed through. All three cars that were behind the one I had fled from showed no evidence that they had ever been occupied. While I stared off the back of the train, taking in the vast empty landscape in our wake, I knew what I had to do. Clearly they had not fled backwards, leaving only one logical direction. As he had not carried her back through the doorway he entered, I had to deduce they had gone up to the roof of the train. I sprinted back through the cars until I reached the doorway to the one I'd left. Though my hands still violently trembled, I reached for the ladder, which led to the roof with my still bleeding hand. I had no idea what to do if I caught up to the conductor, but I at least had to attempt to save the little girl from whatever he had planned for her. I had never put anyone's needs before my own my entire life. Perhaps it was the guilt I still felt over what I'd done to my cousin that drove me to attempt a likely ill-fated rescue. I knew I would likely not survive this, but there was something about that girl. I had to savor it, no matter the cost. The strong wind was freezing when I reached the snow-covered roof, which honestly felt quite remarkable at first given the stifling heat inside. Still, it didn't take long for the cold to feel as though it was biting right through me. The chill aggravated my still leaking hand, though the blood flow had slowed considerably. As I paced on, I found it difficult to even hold myself upright, let alone push my body onward. But I knew I had to. The first several steps required far more effort than I'd hoped, leaving me unsure if I would be even capable of completing my self-appointed mission. Perhaps it was the guilt I still felt over what I'd done to my cousin. That inspired me to continue to force one foot in front of the other, but I dreaded to think what the cute little pig-headed girl was enduring while I trudged through the thick snow. Once I got into a rhythm, I managed to quicken my pace, but only slightly. Pushing against the strong and icy wind, combined with the high strides I was having to take to break each step free from the snow, made swift progress out of the question. But it progressed nonetheless. I could barely see 4 feet in front of me, let alone whatever distance I would have to traverse before reaching a battle I was sure to lose. But I wouldn't let that stop me. I plundered on with purpose, and with every single successful step, I was more and more driven by that. I had no way of telling how much time had passed by as I leapt from train car to train car. The first jump was the hardest and the most terrifying, but not unlike those initial hesitant footfalls. Every leap was less scary than the last. By the time I saw a faint light ahead of me, I had successfully cleared 6 boxcars. As I drew closer to the light, I could see it flickered like fire, though it appeared to float several feet above the roof. "You should not be here, little boy." A voice even deeper than that of the conductor spoke. The shimmering light moved closer to me, revealing what appeared to be an incredibly tall person with an ancient-looking fire lantern for a head. It wore a long, brown, snow-speckled coat, which came down to feet that were buried in the snow. Its long arms hung just past, where I presumed its knees to be, as it stared down at me. Well, as much as a lamp can stare, I suppose. Still, I could feel it glaring at me, causing that same discomfort that the conductor's wide eyes gave me. "I have to get by," I said, doing my best impersonation of someone with actual confidence in their words. Without another word, its long arms reached towards me. I ducked down and rolled through the snow, managing to avoid its grasp, but this did not get me any closer to my goal. It swiped at me with the right arm, following with another swing from its left. Fortunately, the thing did not move quickly, and I found myself able to dodge. It just continued to swat me, while I tumbled and leapt around the elongated limbs while attempting to locate any way of getting past. Finally, I noticed a split in the long coat, where the buttons ended just above the presumed knees. As both arms reached out for me again, I jumped forwards into the open section of the trench coat. The legs I now crouched between looked thin and frail, so before the bony hands, which were attempting to reach me through the opening, could grab me, I kicked at the left foot which stood in the thick snow to my right. Even with my small and weak stature, it didn't take much force to cause the tall creature to stumble. As the leg I kicked slid to the side of the roof of the train, the other came crashing down on me. Before it could pummel me to the ground, I rolled out through the curtain-like back of the long coat. Once I was clear, I turned around to see arms and legs flailing as the lamp-headed thing stumbled off the speeding train. I saw nothing more than a quick flash of light followed by a thin line of smoke rising from where I assumed it made contact out of the ground. With my heart still hammering, I stood up on my trembling legs and started back on the path in the hopes of tracking my quarry before whatever the conductor had planned for the little girl occurred. Though I feared I would run into another of whatever that thing with the flickering head was, I did not run into any more obstacles until I reached the front of the train. The carriages ended with only a long trolley filled with coal and the engine just ahead of it. Just as I started to gather up enough courage to leap into the rough and jagged coal, I found myself nearly paralyzed with fear when a familiar voice spoke from behind me. "And where do you think you're going?" The conductor spoke directly into my ear. I spun in place to see his wide eyes and grinning face only inches from mine. He stood in place, leaning over at the waist to gaze directly at me. I could barely form anything close to actual words while we stared at one another. "Well, speak up, boy." His darkened eyes formed that unsettling scowl again. The girl," I said in little more than a whisper. "Dejected, I'm afraid. Would you like to join her?" We just stared at each other for a moment. I was terrified that I was about to be launched from this very spot, only to crash down to the ground around us. I couldn't help but wonder if this would be a better option to whatever the hell he had in store for me if I were to be permitted to remain on board. "I didn't think so," he said, wrapping his fingers around my face and lifting me from the snowy roof. I braced myself in preparation for being tossed like a rag doll, but he didn't throw me over the side. He just stomped in wide strides, with me hanging from my head in his outstretched arm. He stepped in wide strides, crossing the carriages much faster than my tiny legs had. Though I wouldn't say I was particularly comfortable dangling like a fleshy Christmas ornament by the face, I was beginning to feel secure that my punishment may not be overly severe this time. Naturally, I got far too ahead of myself. When he said, stopping in place, he glanced back into my eyes, one of which was covered by his large palm. "It's quite cool out here, isn't it?" With those words, my heart began to race again. There was one rule. I hadn't broken the law of the train by climbing out of my seat. Not when I crossed through the other cars, nor when I tipped my attacker off the side. Stepping out into the cold night air in the first place, however, that's where I crossed the line. The smile on the conductor's face practically extended to his ears as the malice formed on his brow once more. He tilted his head to the side, studying what he could see of my face through his fingers. He reached his other hand up and snapped his fingers again, causing the hand which held me to burst into flames. The pain was immediate and unbearable. I screamed out as my skin bubble popped and dripped onto my shoulder while fluids leaked down the conductor's arm. I could feel my flesh peeling away in thin sheets while my eyeballs popped and oozed from their sockets. As the tall man paced on, I lost all track of the passage of time, existing only in the insufferable agony of my melting head. Somewhere along the line, I must have blacked out. It wasn't until my body was tossed onto the hard floor of the cabin, behind the one which still held the other terrified children, that I became aware once more. As soon as my regrown eyes opened, I grabbed at my face to find that everything felt intact again, though I remembered every single excruciating second before I passed out. "Should I strap you down, or will you behave?" he asked, glaring down at me with his hands behind his back. I just nodded, unable to make my voice work, hoping that he would understand which part of his question I was agreeing to. I grabbed onto the armrest of the chair closest to me and heaved myself up from the floor. I planted down into the seat, to which the conductor returned a nod. He then spun in place, stepped through the door, before gently sliding it shut. As soon as he was out of sight, I fell into wailing sobs before curling up in the fetal position on the chair. Hours seemed to trickle by as I lay across the seats, trying my hardest to fall asleep to escape this nightmare. Every time I closed my eyes, it was as though I saw myself from the outside, watching my face melt away. I also couldn't evade the guilt I was feeling for being unable to save the little girl who was apparently thrown from the train. I couldn't figure out why the conductor got so angry at her, nor why he appeared unaware of her even being there in the first place. Of course, nothing made any sense since I boarded this hell on wheels. After giving up on my attempts to sleep, I sat back upright in my seat to look out the window at the world beyond the glass. I no longer saw the same snowy landscape, but an unnerving lack of anything. It wasn't like the night sky had grown so dark, hiding the world behind its blanket. It was just nothingness. Though the train still felt as though it were speeding along the metal tracks, I saw no evidence of any road through the seemingly endless void. It was almost hypnotizing to look upon, though my mind could not make any rational sense of it. The longer I gazed through the glass, the more the emptiness mesmerized me. "Did he hurt you?" The voice practically caused me to leap from my skin as I sat, zoned out in front of the window. I slowly turned my body around to see Sophie once more, perched on a seat across from me. "Is it really you?" I asked, pressing my back against the glass, fearing this was some sort of trick being played on me. "Thank you." She cut her eyes down to the floor. "For trying to rescue me." "He said he ejected you," I said. I still wasn't ready to believe that this wasn't some sort of cruel trick. "He tried. I thought I was done for, but I managed to grab onto the railing before I hit the ground," she replied. She still wouldn't meet my eyes, which only made me feel less willing to believe what she was saying. I just continued to stare at her. I couldn't even begin to fathom the odds of her claims being possible, even though I was just a child. Santa Claus? Yes, of course he was real, regardless of what my cousin thought. Scooby-Doo? Obviously based on true events. I'm sure he couldn't really talk, but they have to exaggerate things for TV. A young girl being tossed from a speeding train in the middle of an icy cold expanse, luckily wrapping her fingers around a metal railing, saving herself from certain doom, unlikely at best. I swear I'm telling the truth, she pleaded, finally locking eyes with me, while sliding off her seat to cross the aisle towards me. I still pushed my body against the glass, terrified of the possibilities of what actually stood before me, dressed up as a little girl. That was until she sat beside me and placed her warm hand on the side of my face. There was something about her touch that caused my heart to regulate for the first time since stepping into this godforsaken train. I hadn't even realized I was trembling this whole time, until my skin stopped shivering, my back relaxed, and my body almost drooped exhaustively from the weight of all of the pain and anguish I had suffered, fading away into the background. Before I knew it, I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her close to me. I laid my head on her shoulder, and I cried harder than I had in years, even more than after the conductor left me alone in his carriage. I wailed from the lingering guilt to the actions that led me here, along with so many others that had only now become clear. Yes, I was just a small child. It's easy to claim that I didn't know any better, but I did. Somewhere in the deepest pits in my mind, I knew what a spoiled and selfish little bastard I was, and for the first time ever, I wanted to change. I saw flashes of the exhausted looks on my parents' face when I would lose it in public or around others. I heard the sounds of my mother sobbing when I pushed her way too far so many times. At that very moment, as I spilled a seemingly endless river of tears onto Zafi's coat, I swore I would make things right if I was ever able to return to my home again. Truth be told, I could have sat there for hours, content in the arms of someone I'd never laid eyes on before this day, but like every other fleeting fancy on this voyage of the damned, it was to be short-lived. I didn't even hear the doors slide back open before the bellowing voice of the no longer smiling conductor raged from the front of the cab. "How did you get back here?" In an instant, Zafi pulled away from me and leapt from the seat to stand in the center of the aisle, glaring up at the tall man in the dark red suit, just as she had before. She didn't even appear frightened while they waged a staring battle that sent shivers up the length of my spine while forming goosebumps across my skin. "You have overstepped your bounds, Abigail," the little girl said, in a voice strong and proud. "This train is mine, Sophie. You have no jurisdiction here." His voice sounded sinister as it moaned the words filled with sheer hatred. As the conductor slowly paced towards her, a long and jagged blade manifested in his hand, which reflected the dim lights of the cabin across the walls, while the pigtailed little girl stood her ground as David facing the hulking Goliath. I found myself filled with a purpose I'd never felt before, though it was similar to what struck me when he first pulled her from her seat in the other carriage. That urge, no, that need to protect her. This was far more intense. This child was special. She was scared. I never performed a selfless act my entire life. Well, all 10 years of it, anyway. It was time for me to make my stand. My own fear practically melted away the instant I saw the man reach for his sword high above his head to strike her down while she bowed her head, seemingly accepting her fate. As the scene played out before me in almost slow motion, I jumped from my seat, pushing Zafi away from the approaching man. "Run," I said, offering a sincere smile to the girl who now stared at me with tears welling in her eyes. I stood in place, blocking her from the sword which sliced down through the air to split me in two. I closed my eyes, feeling content in the knowledge that her face would be the last thing I would ever see. An awful, self-consumed brat dies so that a brave and wonderful little girl can live. Yeah, that's a fair trade. I felt proud of my actions, a feeling I'd never known before. If you could make one wish, what would it be? I couldn't make out where the voice was coming from. I couldn't figure out where I was, for that matter. I had no body, not one I could see or feel, anyway. I could see, but everything was shielded by an intense bright light. I think it was my street, though it was hard to tell. Was it my street? Who exactly am I? It was as though everything was hidden in plain sight, behind a translucent curtain of sorts. So, what would you wish for? Anything at all. I asked through non-existent lips. Within reason, of course. I knew that voice. I had heard it only recently. She was familiar to me. But how? Where was I before I was here? It has to be something personal, something unique to you and your life. What do you mean? I was growing a vague awareness of who I was. But what was it that I desired? Some ask for riches, others for fame. That could be nice, I replied. Is that what I really wanted, though? There are those who wish for beauty. You could grow to be the most handsome of men. Attractive people do tend to have more doors open to them than others. Perhaps I could have it all. Money, fame, looks. No, that's not what I ached for. I had a wish not too long ago. You could have a life many would envy. I couldn't I? No, that's not what I wanted. Not like this, anyway. Can I go back? The question presented itself before I even understood what I was asking for. Back. I did something, didn't I? I did something bad. What was it? I want to change something that happened. Yesterday. Was it yesterday? It wasn't long ago, was it? When is it now, for that matter? Is that what you would wish for? You could have it all, you know. No, I made a mistake. I want to take it back. Can I wish for that? Please, let me change this one thing. Let me set things right. I think I remember now. It was bad. I was bad. One more chance. That's all I want. Perhaps you can. You know, Santa's not real, right? You're 10 years old now. You're way too old for that baby shit. She was poking me in the chest, giggling after every sentence. I hated it when she acted like this. So what if I still wanted to believe? What's it to her, anyway? The more she pushed and prodded, the more I could feel my face flush. If she was going to act this way, she shouldn't even be in my bedroom. Stop it, I said, pushing her back with every ounce of my strength after she jabbed me in the chest again. Her eyes widened and her lower lip quivered as she looked into my infuriated red face. Just as I readied myself to push her again, something struck me. Deja vu? No, I remember this. There's something else, that scar in the center of my hand. Suddenly, a veil lifted before my eyes. Memories spilled back into my mind, as though they poured from a jug. My scowl softened. My face cooled. I looked up into the eyes of my older cousin and suddenly felt a stab of guilt. What the hell? Courtney cried out as I wrapped my arms around her. I'm so sorry, I said while my eyes welled up. You are so damn weird, she said, pushing me away before running down the stairs. I stood alone in my bedroom, watching her swiftly move out of my sight, descending the stairs the proper way, as she should have been permitted to do the first time. I turned my gaze back to the interior of my room, glancing at all of my wonderful belongings. More toys and games than the average kid could hope for, lazily scattered around my spacious bedroom. Items purchased with love, which I showed as little respect for as those who bought them for me. I practically sprinted down the steps towards the dining room, to where my parents stood surrounded by family and friends. I could tell my father tensed up as soon as I entered the room. No doubt he was prepared for yet another day of my whining, bitching, and moaning. The look on his face was almost comical. When I ran forward to hug him, he and my mother shared a shocked stare while I extended my arms around her too. You okay, kiddo? He asked reluctantly while placing his hand on the top of my head. I just looked up at my folks with tears still trickling down my face. I'm so sorry for everything. I promise I'm going to try to do better. I love you both so much. They stared down at me and back at each other, completely lost for words. Things changed dramatically in the weeks that followed that Christmas Eve I lived through twice. It took a while for my family to accept that I'd actually changed my ways, but before long, I was closer to my mom and dad than I'd ever been. Even Courtney became almost like a sister to me. Though she was a few years older than I, she only lived a few blocks away. She would babysit me for free, when my folks would enjoy the occasional night out. Another thing they'd been hard-pressed to achieve when I was still a screeching, fit-pitching little brat, is nobody would have any desire to take care of me in their absence. The full memories of my experience on the train took some time to reform in the back of my mind, but the lessons I learned have stayed with me to this day. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the other children I shared that train car with. Perhaps they had their own trials to endure before they would be set free. I can only hope they succeeded as I did on occasion. I allow myself to wonder if the entire experience had only been in my head, but the small circular scar that still remains on the palm and the back of my hand would suggest that was not the case. Some years back, I married and fathered a child, A boy who is almost as prone to tantrums as I was at his age. My wife and I are trying everything we can. Though little seems to have any effect, maybe this is my karma for being such an insufferable little shit before I found a better way to live. Though my experience almost 20 years ago now still causes me to jerk awake from a graphic and horrible nightmare from time to time, I'm grateful for that hellish trip. My son is 10 years old now, the same age I was when my outlook changed for the better. I can't deny there's a little voice in the back of my head that secretly hopes the train arrives for him this Christmas Eve. I've been a gardener for the Hartwell Mansion for 5 years now. It wasn't the kind of job I ever thought I'd have, but life has a way of steering you into places you never expected. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's business and nothing much ever changes. My mom raised me on her own, working long hours as a seamstress to make sure we had what we needed. She was tough but kind, the kind of person who'd give you her last dollar if it meant you'd be okay. Hard work isn't something I shy away from. I've always liked having something to do with my hands, whether it's fixing an old fence or planting a row of vegetables. There's something honest about it, something that clears your mind. I never needed much else. I'm 35 now, but I moved to this area when I was 30. Mom got sick, cancer, and I came here to take care of her. We didn't have anyone else, so it was just the two of us like it had always been. I rented a small place nearby and spent my days driving her to appointments, cooking her meals, and sitting by her side when the treatments left her too weak to get up. She passed away 6 months later. It hit me hard, but I stayed. Maybe because I didn't have anywhere else to go, or maybe because I didn't know what else to do. I liked the quiet here, the way the fields stretched out for miles and the hills rolled up against the sky. I took odd jobs at first, painting fences, fixing roofs, anything to pay the bills. And then I heard about the Hartwell Mansion. They were looking for a gardener, someone who could handle the grounds and wasn't afraid of a little isolation. Sounded perfect to me. People warned me about the place before I even started. That's the haunted mansion, they said, shaking their heads. You don't want to mess with that. I didn't think much of it at the time. Ghost stories don't pay the bills, and I've never been one to scare easily. The mansion is up on a hill, surrounded by tall iron gates and trees so old they look like they've been there since the dawn of time. The first time I saw it, I thought it was beautiful in a strange way. The kind of beauty that makes you stop and stare, even if it unsettles you a little. Plants here die faster than a pot of boiling water dries up, but it's my job to keep the grounds looking respectable. Nobody expects perfect roses, but I can at least keep them from turning into black sticks overnight. I've learned to live with strange things. A stoic attitude helps. If you jump at every creak in the floorboards or eerie shadows flickering through the fog, you won't last a day. That's what O'Reilly, the human caretaker, told me when I first started. O'Reilly's been here longer than I have, longer than anyone who's still breathing. He's wiry, with a face like an old tree. Tough, but somehow still warm. He's good company when we're both on the clock, though we mostly work in different parts of the mansion. He takes care of the inside. I take care of the outside in the mansion. Well, it takes care of itself. It didn't take long for me to meet the others. The first was Lady Laverne, the resident fortune teller and formal herbalist. Her crystal ball sits on a tall wooden pedestal in the library, wedged between dusty tomes and half-melted candles. I remember stumbling upon her on my second day, thinking it was some kind of tacky decor, and then her voice echoed through the room. Well, another victim of Hartwell's peculiar hiring process. I nearly dropped the watering can. Her face appeared in the swirling mist inside the crystal ball. She was sharp-featured and elegant, with eyes that sparkled like a stormy sea. She sounded like she'd swallowed a thesaurus, always using big words and dramatic flourishes. Oh, it's not much of a life being stuck in this glass prison, but it's better than the alternative. Don't touch the curtains. They're hideous. I've been trapped here for centuries, and the decor hasn't improved one bit. She wasn't wrong about the decor. Every room in the mansion looks like it's been ripped from a dozen different eras, none of which match. Then there's Headless Jack. He's the kind of guy who could probably win you over at a bar if you weren't, headless. Jack pops up when you least expect him. You'll be pruning a hedge or sweeping a hallway, and suddenly there he is, carrying his head under one arm. "Hey, Tom. Hey, be careful with those rose bushes." They bite back, he said one evening. His head blinked and gave me a wink. I'll admit, the first time I saw him, I froze. But Jack's got a way of putting people at ease. He's sarcastic and quick-witted, like a comedian who happens to just be missing something. Last but not least is Count Bernard. He's technically a vampire, though I've never seen him drink anything except the thick red liquid in his goblet. Could be wine, could be blood. I don't ask. Bernard spends most of his time in the dining room, where he critiques the cook's meals like a snobby food critic. "This stew is an abomination. Do you call this seasoning? I've seen better efforts from the rats in the cellar," he announced one evening. As I walked past the doorway, the cook, a cranky old ghost named Frank, slammed his spoon down. "You can't even eat it, Bernard." How the hell would you know? The bickering is endless but oddly comforting. During the day, the mansion opens to tourists. They pay good money for Hartwell's haunted experience, which includes fake fog machines, spooky soundtracks, and jump scares. The tourists have no idea that the haunts are real. They think Lady Laverne's crystal ball is a clever trick, and that Headless Jack is a paid actor. Jack loves playing into it. He'll pop up behind a tour group, his head tucked under one arm, and give them a little bow. The screams echo all the way to the garden. Bernard, on the other hand, despises the tourist and hides whenever they're around. "Humans, vapid creatures with no sense of decorum," he mutters with disgust. The only place off limits to the tours and everyone else is the West Wing. No one talks about the West Wing. It's the one part of the mansion I've never seen. They didn't lock it up, but they might as well have. Heavy velvet ropes stretch across the entrance, and old wooden screens block off the hallway leading to it. O'Reilly told me not to ask about it. I don't pry. I don't need to. The West Wing was the master's section of the house. His bedroom, his private study, and who knows what else. When he died, they sectioned it off, and no one's been inside since. Not even the ghost. Still, the West Wing looms. It's a constant presence in the mansion, a secret hidden behind ropes and screens, and like all good secrets, it's only a matter of time before someone tries to uncover it. There's a rule about the Hartwell mansion. If you die here, you stay here forever. I didn't believe it at first. O'Reilly told me on my third day. Matter of fact, as if he were reminding me to lock the greenhouse doors. He tightened his grip on the mop he was holding and explained it plainly. Once you were there, you became part of the place, and it didn't let go. I thought he was joking until I met Daisy. Now Daisy's a dog, or she used to be. Now she's a skeleton of what must have been a big, proud German shepherd. I think her bones click and clatter when she walks, but she still carries herself like she's alive. Her tail wags when she's happy, even though it's just a string of vertebrae. We met on my first day. I was planting daisies near the fountain, trying to make the place look less like the set of a horror movie. I'd barely gotten the last bulb in the ground, but she came bounding up out of nowhere. She dug up the whole patch in seconds, dirt flying everywhere. "You are a menace," I told her, shaking my head, but I couldn't stay mad at her. Not when she sat there wagging her bony tail like she'd done me a favor. I named her Daisy right then and there, and she's been my companion ever since. The lore around the mansion is that once you're inside, the outside world forgets about you. At least that's what the ghosts say. Some of them swear they've tried to leave, only to find themselves right back at the front door. It's not just ghosts. Creatures live here too. Some are as friendly as Jack and Daisy, and others not so much. I've learned to keep my head down, stick to my work, and avoid certain parts of the house after dark. One of the things O'Reilly told me was to never wander alone at night. Daytime was fine, but nighttime was different. Most of the residents were harmless, but there were a few you would not want to run into after dark. I've had a few close calls. Once I was trimming the hedges near the back gate when I heard heavy footsteps behind me. When I turned around, nothing was there, but the roses nearby were crushed, as if something had barreled through them. Daisy stood in front of me, her bony frame stiff as a board. She growled, a low rattle that echoed in the quiet garden. You know what? Let's call it a day, I said, backing away. Daisy stuck close to my side all the way back to the main path. The mansion runs on a mix of mystery and money. There's a family fund that pays O'Reilly and May, though I've never met anyone who claims to be a Hartwell. It's enough to keep the place standing and pay for basic upkeep, but the real money comes from the supernatural tours. During the day, the house feels almost normal, bustling with visitors, snapping photos and marveling at the special effects. Most think Daisy is some kind of animatronic, a clever trick for the show, and I let them believe it. The rest of the mansion's operation is obscure. O'Reilly handles the books, but even he shrugs when I ask where the money comes from. There's something unsettling about that, but I try not to think about it too much. The mansion has a way of making you accept things you'd normally question. Daisy keeps me sane. I talk to her while I work, partly to pass the time, and partly because she listens better than most people. You know, these flowers don't stand a chance. I don't know. I'll give it a shot. Maybe they'll last a week, I said one morning, crouched beside a bush that had already started to wilt. Daisy sat beside me, tilting her bony head as if she understood. Her jaw opened and closed in what I could only describe as a pantomime of a dog's panting. Yeah, you know what? You're right. They're doomed. She followed me around the garden, her bones clinking softly with each step. Sometimes I'd toss her a stick to see what she'd do. She'd pick it up, shake it like a real dog, and drop it at my feet. You're a good girl, I said, scratching the air where her ears used to be, her tail wagging, a rhythmic clatter against the cobblestones. Daisy's more than just a companion. She's a reminder that not everything in this place is grim or dangerous. Some things, even in a cursed mansion, can still bring a little light. Of course, not everyone here is as friendly as Daisy. There are things in the mansion I haven't met and I don't want to. O'Reilly calls them the quiet ones, though we won't say much beyond that. He always insisted the best way to avoid trouble was to keep your head down and focus on the work. That was the only way to stay on their good side, if they even had one. So I focus on the plans, the grounds, and Daisy. The rest, I'll leave it to the mansion. Better that way. For now, the West Wing stays roped off. The residents keep to their routines, and I do my best to keep the garden alive, one doomed flower bed at a time. It was late when the last group of kids finally left the mansion. A school trip, they called it, but it felt more like babysitting a pack of wild animals. They'd screamed at every creak of the floorboards, pounded on the old furniture, and left sticky fingerprints on nearly every surface. By the time the tour guide ushered them out, the place felt more alive than the ghosts themselves. O'Reilly and I stayed back to clean up, as we always did after the tours. The mansion needed to be ready for the next day, and neither of us liked leaving things half done. Daisy, exhausted from the chaos, had curled up by the fire in the library. She looked peaceful, her bony frame rising and falling like she was dreaming of chasing rabbits. I made a pot of coffee in the kitchen. It was the least I could do for O'Reilly after a day like this. His mop leaned against the wall, and he sat in an old chair near the hearth. His shoulders slouched from years of hard work. I brought him a steaming cup and settled into the chair across from him. The library was quiet now. The only sounds, the crackling fire and the occasional rattle of Daisy's bones as she shifted in her sleep. The warmth of the flames felt good after the chill of the day. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the heat spread through me. My mind wandered, as it often did during quiet moments like this. The West Wing, always sectioned off and looming in the mansion's shadow, crept into my thoughts. It had been on my mind for months now, the unanswered questions gnawing at me. Everyone whispered about it, but no one ever seemed to say much directly. The West Wing was more than an abandoned part of the mansion. It felt like the heart of the curse that held this place together. It was where the ghosts came from, where the strange creatures seemed drawn to, and where Daisy never strayed. I'd seen her stop at the velvet ropes before, her bones stiffening, as if she was afraid to go inside. I'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone who worked here had. The West Wing was said to be the most dangerous part of the mansion, a place where even a ghost feared to linger. The air itself was said to feel heavier there, like it was pressing against you, daring you to step inside. The stories about the mansion's old master always seemed tied to it, though the details varied depending on who you asked. Some said he was a madman, consumed by his own genius. Others said he was cursed long before the mansion ever became what it is now. But the version that stuck with me the most was the one about his fiancée. The master of the house had been a brilliant inventor, a man of extraordinary talent and ambition. He'd studied abroad at a prestigious university, earning the kind of education that only the wealthiest and most gifted could afford. When he returned, he was eager to share his inventions with the world. He had plans, blueprints for machines that could change industries, revolutionize the way people lived. He trusted his fiancée with these plans, sharing them in confidence, believing in her love and loyalty. But she betrayed him. She gave his blueprints to another man, not only breaking his heart, but destroying everything he'd worked for. The inventions were stolen, the credit taken by someone else. His name was tarnished, his reputation ruined. According to this version of the story, the betrayal consumed him with rage. In his fury, he set fire to the west wing of the mansion, destroying everything he'd once held dear. The fire gutted the place, leaving it charred and blackened, a skeleton of what it once was. The west wing remained that way, untouched and abandoned. The curse seemed to center there, spreading its influence throughout the mansion but never leaving its source. There were stories about what happened to those who dared enter. Some were said to come out changed, their minds broken, or their bodies marked by some terrible fate. Others, they didn't come out at all. The rumors were grim, people setting fires, jumping from windows, falling ill with inexplicable diseases. No case was ever officially linked to the mansion. The authorities couldn't prove anything, and most didn't want to dig too deep. But those who worked here, who lived here, knew the truth. Daisy stirred by the fire, her tail giving a slow wag for a moment. I wondered if she'd known the master of the house. The thought gave me pause. Daisy was a mystery in her own right, a loyal companion who seemed as much a part of the mansion as the walls themselves. She'd been here long before me, long before O'Reilly even, and yet she never wandered far from the living spaces. The West Wing was off limits to her, as it was the rest of us. O'Reilly once said that some places are better left alone, and I was starting to understand what he meant. The mansion had its secrets, and while curiosity pulled at me, I knew better than to push too far. The fire crackled softly as I finished my coffee, the warmth settling deep in my bones. O'Reilly set his empty cup on the small table beside him and stretched. The weariness of the day etched into his movements. Daisy shifted again, her tail giving another faint wag before she settled back into stillness. We closed up for the night, locking the doors and turning out the lights. The mansion was quiet again, the kind of stillness that settles in once the day's chaos is past. I didn't think much about the West Wing after that night by the fire. O'Reilly's stories were chilling, sure, but they felt just like that. Stories. At least that's what I told myself. And then the ghost hunters came. It was a group of 4, 2 men and 2 women, all in their early 20s. They came in during the last tour of the day, carrying cameras and EMF detectors like they were stepping onto a Hollywood set. One of them, a tall, cocky guy with slicked back hair, stood out immediately. He spoke loudly, cracking jokes and acting like he owned the place. I could tell his friends were embarrassed. They kept apologizing to the tour. Guy tried to keep him in line. His girlfriend, a quiet woman with long dark hair, seemed especially nervous, like she was second-guessing the whole trip. When the group reached the West Wing, the guy did their usual spiel, warning everyone not to cross the ropes. The area was forbidden and even the spirits avoided it, they explained, lowering their voice for dramatic effect. That was all the tall guy needed to hear. Later that evening, after the tour had ended and the group was supposed to be gathering things to leave, I spotted him slipping away. He ducked under the ropes and disappeared into the West Wing, a flashlight in his hand. His girlfriend called after him, but he waved her off, laughing, and told her he'd be back after 10 minutes. I figured he'd take a look, scare himself, and come running back. He was gone longer than I expected. His friends started getting worried, calling his name and pacing near the ropes just as they were about to go after him. He reappeared, but he wasn't the same. He didn't say a word, didn't crack a joke, didn't even make eye contact. His face was pale, and his hand shook as he handed the flashlight back to one of his friends. When they asked him what happened, he just mumbled that they needed to go and started walking toward the exit. The group left quickly, their earlier excitement replaced by uneasy silence. It stuck with me the way he looked, like he'd seen something he couldn't explain, something he wished he hadn't. But I still didn't believe the stories. Not fully. Not until I read the news. A few weeks later, the same man had jumped from a second-story window of his apartment. He didn't die, but he broke his arm pretty badly. The article said he'd been acting strange in the days leading up to it, locking himself in his room and refusing to talk to anyone after the man who'd snuck into the forbidden part of the house ended up in the news. I started looking at the place a little differently. Still, the day-to-day didn't change much. O'Reilly and I opened up the mansion as usual. It was another school trip, this time with younger kids. They couldn't have been more than, 7 or 8 years old, all dressed in matching school uniforms that made them look like a row of tiny penguins, all of them except one. There was a little girl in a bright yellow raincoat, her blonde hair tied neatly in a bun. She stood out like a light bulb. It was hard not to notice her, bouncing along at the back of the group with her hands stuffed into her coat pockets. She looked shy, keeping to herself while the other kids ran ahead, pointing and shouting at everything they saw. I smiled to myself as I headed to the greenhouse. Kids had a way of bringing life to the place, even if they left sticky handprints on everything. I was pruning flowers when the little girl wandered in. She must have slipped away from her group, her yellow raincoat catching the sunlight as she peeked around the door. Instead of scolding her, I knelt down to her level, holding my clippers loosely in one hand. "Well, hey there. What brings you over here? You lost?" She hesitated, clutching the edge of her coat. Her eyes darted to the greenhouse door like she was thinking about running, but then she looked back at me. I smiled and reached for a yellow daffodil blooming near the edge of the planter. I said, plucking it carefully. "This one looks like you." I held it out to her, the bright petals almost matching her raincoat. She giggled. A small sound. She took the flower, turning it over in her little hands. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name?" I asked. "Lucy." "Well, Lucy, I'm Tom. Nice to meet you." She nodded, still holding the flower. And then she looked up at me with wide eyes. "I don't like ghosts," she blurted out. I raised an eyebrow. "You don't?" She shook her head quickly. "The kids in my class make fun of me because I'm scared of them. They think it's funny, but I don't." I leaned back on my heels, thinking. Ghosts can be afraid of you too," I said after a moment. Her eyes widened. "Really?" "Yeah, really. The trick is to look right at them. They only move when you look away, but if you look straight at them like this," I demonstrated with an exaggerated stare, making her giggle. "Well, they usually back off. They're not as tough as they seem," I said. Lucy smiled, her grip on the daffodil relaxing. "I'll try that," she said. "Good. Now let's get you back to your group before they realize you're missing." I stood up and walked her to the greenhouse door, keeping an eye out for her teacher. When we spotted the group, I pointed them out and she nodded. "Thanks, Tom," she said, waving as she ran back to join him. I waved back, watching until Lucy disappeared into the crowd of tiny penguins. The little daffodil I'd given her peeked out of the pocket in her yellow raincoat, and her small smile was the last thing I saw before she rejoined her group. The rest of the day unfolded in its usual rhythm. The tours came and went, the sound of excited chatter echoing through the mansion. I worked quietly in the greenhouse, pruning and watering the plants, letting the activity around the house fade into the background. The calm held until the commotion started. It was just before the last tour of the day when raised voices broke through the usual noise. There were hurried footsteps and a wave of panic that seemed to spread through the mansion. Putting down my tools, I left the greenhouse and headed toward the source. In the main hall, the air was thick with tension. O'Reilly stood near the teacher, who looked pale and anxious, her hands twisting nervously. A group of children huddled nearby, their usual energy replaced by a heavy silence. The scene made the reason for the disturbance obvious. Something was wrong. The teacher explained in rushed, shaky sentences that the group had done a head count before leaving, only to find Lucy absent. They'd searched everywhere they could think of. The library, the dining hall, even outside the mansion. But there was no sign of her. Lucy was missing. The teacher's face was pale as she explained how they'd searched every corner of the mansion, calling for her, but she was nowhere to be found. The other children stood in small groups, their usual energy replaced by nervous silence. O'Reilly, his jaw tight, started managing the adults and kids, asking questions and making sure no one wandered off. I scanned the group and noticed 3 boys huddled together near the back, their faces pale, their eyes wide with guilt. They avoided looking at anyone, their shifting feet betraying their anxiety. I approached them, my boots heavy on the floor, and they flinched slightly when I stepped in front of them. "What happened?" I asked, and it didn't take much for them to break. One of them stammered through an explanation, his voice trembling. They dared Lucy to go into the West Wing, calling her scaredy cat and laughing when she protested. The other 2 chimed in, each trying to defend themselves. But the truth was clear. They bullied her into it. My stomach churned. Of all the places in the mansion, the West Wing was the most dangerous. It was like a maze, filled with crumbling architecture, blackened walls, and worse things that lurked in the shadows. If Lucy was in there, I needed to get her out and fast. I turned to O'Reilly. He understood immediately, nodding as he stepped in to manage the chaos. He spoke quickly to the teacher, explaining that the mansion would be closed for the rest of the day and that all remaining tours were canceled. He started organizing the children, keeping them in one place while assuring the adults that everything was under control. Meanwhile, I headed for the library. Daisy trotted after me, her bony frame clicking softly on the wooden floors. I didn't have a clear plan yet, but I knew I couldn't go into the West Wing blind. There was someone in the mansion who might be able to help, though her advice often came wrapped in riddles. Lady Laverne's crystal ball sat on its usual pedestal in the library, surrounded by dusty books and flickering candles. Her face materialized in the swirling mist inside the glass as I approached, her sharp eyes narrowing as she noticed Daisy and me. Well, the gardener seeks my counsel." "This must be serious," her voice echoed. "It is about a little girl who has gone into the West Wing. I need your help to find her." Laverne's expression softened slightly, though her sharp features remained unreadable. "The West Wing, a labyrinth of ruin and rage. You're brave to even consider entering." I didn't respond, my jaw tightening. There wasn't time for compliments or warnings. She studied me for a moment, the mist in the crystal ball swirling faster. "The girl is the light in the darkness, a beacon, bright and small. She is near, but in danger." That leaned closer, trying to catch every word. "What danger?" Lady Laverne's expression shifted, her sharp eyes narrowing as the mist inside the crystal ball swirled violently. "The West Wing is not like the rest of the mansion. It's the heart of the curse. You're human, flesh, blood, and bone, and that makes you vulnerable. You have no strength there, not against what you will face. You must use your wit, think quickly, and most of all, you must be brave. Fear will only feed the dangers within. If you falter, they will consume you." I opened my mouth to press her for more specifics, but before I could speak, the library door creaked open. Count Bernard strolled in, his usual air of disdain softened by what looked like genuine concern. His goblet was absent, replaced by a small glass jar in his hand. I couldn't help but overhear the gardener, heading into the West Wing. Brave, perhaps, but very foolish. Without aid, he held up the jar. Inside, 3 tiny glowing blue lights floated lazily, pulsing faintly like tiny heartbeats. Will-o'-wisps, or willows as I call them. You mortals have your legends about them, how they lead travelers to their destinations. Release one, and it will guide you through the West Wing. But he paused, holding up a finger. You only have 3. Use them wisely, gardener. He handed me the jar, his cold fingers brushing mine briefly. The lights inside the jar pulsed brighter for a moment before settling again. I'd heard these tiny things before. Will-o'-wisps were strange little lights like tiny blue flames floating in the air. In legends, they're sent to guide travelers with pure intentions, leading them through forests, swamps, or dark places they'd otherwise get lost in. The stories say they glow brightest for those who are brave, kind or have a purpose worth fighting for. But they're tricky too. Some say they lead those with bad hearts astray, deeper into danger. Thank you, I said, the weight of the jar heavier than it seemed. Bernard gave a curt nod, his usual grumpiness returning. Yes, yes, don't make me regret wasting my goodwill, he said, before stepping back, folding his arms as if he were already done with the matter. Before I could respond, Headless Jack floated through the far wall. He carried his head under his arm, the features twisted with concern. Hey, you're not really gonna do it, are you? You could die in there, you know. And if you do, he hesitated, looking at the jar in my hand. You die in there. You'll be stuck here forever with us. I know, but Lucy doesn't have anyone else. I began. If I can save her, I have to try. Jack frowned, his mouth pulling into a thin line. Oh, the West Wing's different. Even ghosts like me can barely exist there. The curse is too strong, too wild. But he paused, then nodded slowly. Well, if you find yourself in a tight spot, call for me. Oh, I'll come if I can. Thank you, I said. I glanced at the three of them, Laverne, Bernard, and Jack. None of them looked pleased, but there was a kind of reluctant respect in their expressions. They understood the risk, maybe better than I did, and they were still offering their help. I turned to Daisy, who stood by my side, her bony frame still and alert. I crouched down, resting a hand on her smooth skull. You don't have to come with me. This isn't your fight, I said. Daisy tilted her head slightly, her tail giving the faintest wag. She stepped closer, pressing her skeletal frame against my knee in silent defiance. I smiled despite the tension. All right, I guess we're doing this together then. Daisy's tail wagged more enthusiastically, a faint rattle that somehow felt like reassurance. Standing, I gripped the jar of willows tightly in one hand and adjusted the flashlight on my belt with the other, with Daisy at my side. I turned and headed toward the West Wing. The library's warm light faded as we walked, replaced by the dim, cool glow of the mansion's corridors. The weight of what lay ahead pressed on me with every step, but I kept moving. Daisy's steady presence grounded me, her quiet, rattling steps a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. When we reached the entrance to the West Wing, the newly plastered walls and velvet ropes greeted us like a silent warning. I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The jar in my hand pulsed faintly, the tiny blue lights inside swirling gently, as if waiting for my command. I flicked on a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness, and stepped forward. The entrance to the West Wing loomed ahead, and with Daisy at my side and the jar of willows in hand, I crossed the threshold. Whatever waited inside, we would face it together. The West Wing felt like a completely different world. As Daisy and I stepped further inside, the first thing I noticed was how vast it seemed. The ceilings were high, impossibly so, like they stretched endlessly upward. Every sound I made, my boots scuffing against the floor, Daisy's bony clicks, echoed faintly, as though there were unseen depths below us. The floor had a strange, hollow quality, like walking on a drum. It was unnerving, reminding me there were floors beneath this one. Hidden from view, broken glass glittered across the ground, scattered from the broken remains of chandeliers that once hung from above. The walls around us had all been blackened by the fire long ago. Daisy stayed close, her growls quiet but constant, her unease clear in the way she walked. The hallway opened up ahead, leading us into a massive room that could only be described as a grand lobby. I stopped in my tracks, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. The space was cavernous, with blackened beams crisscrossing high above, their edges jagged where the fire had chewed through them. In the center of the room, a chandelier hung from the ceiling, its frame broken and twisted. Beneath it, the remains of old furniture were scattered. A burnt sofa here, a cracked table there. The room split into three directions, each path leading deeper into the West Wing. One went straight ahead, one to the right, and one to the left. I hesitated, staring at the dark corridors. I didn't know where to go. Lucy could be anywhere. And this place felt like it stretched on forever. I glanced down at Daisy, her head tilted up toward me, waiting for me to decide. I remembered Bernard's words. The jar of willows was tucked securely in my pocket, and I pulled it out, unscrewing the lid. The three tiny lights inside floated lazily, glowing faintly blue. Uh, I need help finding Lucy, please. I didn't know if the willows understood me or if I even needed to be polite, but it felt right to ask. One of them stirred, its glow brightening slightly before it floated upward. For a moment, it hovered in front of me, bouncing lightly as if testing the air. And then, with a sudden burst of energy, it veered sharply to the left, leaving a faint trail of blue light in its wake. "All right, let's go, girl," I murmured to Daisy, and we followed. The hallway to the left twisted and turned, its path uneven and cluttered with debris. The faint blue glow of the willow guided us ahead. We passed rooms that must have once been magnificent. There were ballrooms. Their grandness faded, but not forgotten. High ceilings with scorched paintings, long forgotten by time, stretched above us. The remains of chandeliers lay in crumpled heaps, surrounded by broken mirrors and cracked marble floors. The heat grew heavier as we walked, though I try not to think about it too much. Daisy's growls quieted, replaced by determination as she stayed close to my side. The hallway eventually led us to a set of large double doors. Their metal hinges rusted but still intact. The willow passed effortlessly through the crack in the doors, its blue glow spilling faintly into the room beyond. I pushed the doors open slowly, stepping into what looked like a cathedral. The ceiling soared above, impossibly high, supported by blackened beams that arched like the ribs of a giant beast. The room was strangely beautiful. Rows of charred pews stretched ahead. They were cracked and split from years of neglect. At the center of the room was a garden, but it had been dead for a long time. The ground was dry and cracked, with the remains of plants reduced to brittle stalks that crumbled at the slightest touch. In the middle stood a huge tree, its branches bare and twisted, reaching up like bony fingers toward the ceiling. On the far side of the room was a single statue. It was an angel, carved from pale stone. Its wings were large and spread wide, but its face wasn't peaceful. The angel looked down, tears carved into its cheeks. Its hands were held out, palms up, as if catching its own tears. The willow floated in a slow circle around the angel, then came to rest at the base of the tree. Its soft blue glow pulsed faintly before stopping. Daisy let out a low growl and lowered her head, sniffing the ground carefully. "We're close," I said quietly. Before I could move, I heard something behind the angel statue. It was faint at first, like a low creak or groan, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. Daisy stiffened beside me, her tail rattling softly. I turned my head slowly, just enough to peer around the edge of the angel statue. My breath caught in my throat. There was something there, easily 20 feet tall, moving through the cathedral. Its head brushed the ceiling beams, forcing it to hunch its massive shoulders. Its arms hung low, nearly touching the floor, and its movements were slow. I couldn't make out its face, but its sheer size made the room feel even smaller. I ducked behind the base of the angel statue, pressing myself into the cool stone. Daisy crouched beside me, but her tail wouldn't stop rattling softly, a sound like bones knocking together. My heart raced as I grabbed her tail gently, holding it still. "Quiet," I said. The monster moved slowly, its heavy footsteps echoing across the cathedral. It hadn't noticed us yet, but it was getting closer. Every step made the floor beneath me feel like it might give way, and I pressed harder against the base of the statue, hoping its wide wings would keep us hidden. Lady Laverne's warning rang clear in my mind. I couldn't win a physical fight against anything in the West Wing, but I also remembered her other advice. I couldn't be afraid. I closed my eyes and forced myself to take slow, deep breaths through my nose. My chest felt tight, but I made myself stay calm, focusing on each breath as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. For the first time in years, maybe since my mom got sick, I prayed. Wasn't much of a prayer. I couldn't remember the words, and what came out was broken and jumbled. Still, I whispered the only thing I could remember, clinging to it like a lifeline. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. I said it again and again. The monster ducked its head under one of the great arches, moving slowly across the cathedral. Its footsteps grew fainter as it moved further away. its massive form disappearing through a doorway on the other side of the room. I didn't move until the sound of its steps completely faded. When I finally exhaled, I felt like I'd been holding my breath the whole time. I looked at Daisy, who was still crouched beside me, her bones tense but steady. She tilted her skull toward me, as if waiting for my next move. I nodded. Let's go. The willow was still at the base of the angel statue, its soft blue glow dimming slightly. It circled slowly in place, but it didn't move forward. I crouched down beside it, watching as its glow faded completely. It had run out of whatever energy it had, and that meant I only had 2 left. I tucked the jar back into my pocket and stood, glancing at Daisy before stepping forward. The next hallway loomed ahead, dark and twisting, but I had no choice but to keep going. The cathedral's stillness lingered behind us as we moved into the unknown. Daisy stayed close, her rattling footsteps the only sound in the silence. Whatever lay ahead, I knew we had to keep moving. Lucy was still out there, and I wasn't leaving without her. The next set of hallways stretched out ahead. As Daisy and I moved forward, I noticed the walls were covered in paintings. They were everywhere, filling every inch of space. Some were large, dominating the walls with intricate frames, while others were smaller, crammed together like puzzle pieces. The scenes in the paintings varied. Couples dancing in grand ballrooms, knights in shining armor, clashing swords, children playing in parks under sunny skies. Every painting told a different story, a glimpse into different lives in different times. But all of them had one thing in common. Every person in the paintings, no matter the scene, had their mouth wide open in a scream. It wasn't subtle. The expressions were frozen in moments of pure terror, their eyes wide, their faces contorted in agony. Even the children playing in the park were screaming. Their mouths stretched unnaturally, as if caught in a silent, endless wail. I forced myself to keep walking, my flashlight's beam bouncing off the glossy surfaces of the paintings. Daisy stayed close, her clattering steps steady, but I could feel her fear. Her tail didn't wag, and her usual curiosity was gone. The hallway twisted and turned, and the paintings continued. The more I walked, the more it felt like they were watching me. The figures seemed to follow my movements, their unblinking eyes staring as I passed. I focused on the path ahead, not letting my gaze linger too long at any one painting. The further we went, the tighter my grip on the flashlight became. At last, the whole way opened into a crossroads. 3 paths stretched out before me. One set of stairs spiraled upward, vanishing into the ceiling. Another led downward into the dark depths below. The third path veered sharply to the right, disappearing into another hallway. I stopped, my shoulders tense, and glanced down at Daisy. She tilted her head toward me, as if waiting for my decision. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the jar of willows. The 2 remaining lights glowed faintly, their soft blue pulses steady. I unscrewed the lid and whispered, "I need help again. Please show me the way." One of the willows moved, its glow brightening as it floated upward. For a moment, it hovered in front of me, bouncing lightly in air. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, it veered sharply to the right, leaving a faint trail of light behind it. "All right, come on, Daisy," I said, following the willow as it guided us down the hall. The trail led us deeper into the mansion. The halls grew narrower, the walls darker, and the floor beneath us felt colder with every step. Daisy stayed close, her bony frame rattling softly as she kept pace with me. The hallway eventually sloped downward, and I realized we were descending again. The air grew damp, and the faint smell of stale water reached my nose. At the end of the path, we came to a set of broken doors. They hung crooked on their rusted hinges, barely clinging to the frame. Beyond them was a massive ballroom. The willow floated through the broken doorway, circling once, before stopping near the center of the room. Its glow pulsed faintly, then faded completely, leaving us in the dim light of my flashlight. I stepped forward, my boots splashing slightly as they hit the floor. Water covered the ballroom just deep enough to submerge my feet. It rippled faintly as I walked, Daisy's bony legs causing soft splashes as she followed me. The walls of the ballroom glistened, wet to the touch when I placed my hand against one. My stomach tightened as I realized where we were. We were under the lake. The mansion's grounds had a small lake just outside, its still waters reflecting the building on calm days. But now, standing in the ballroom, with water lapping at my ankles and damp walls surrounding mine, I knew we'd gone far below the surface. The room was massive, its ceiling stretching high above, but the water gave it a strange, distorted feeling. The remains of what must have been a grand chandelier lay submerged in the middle of the room, its crystals scattered across the floor. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam catching glimpses of ruined furniture, broken mirrors, and floating debris. Everything was soaked as if the lake itself had begun to claim the room. Daisy let out a low groan, her skull tilted toward the far side of the room. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing, just more water and darkness. The situation felt precarious, the weight of the lake pressing down above us. The willow had led us here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this place wasn't safe. Still, I had no choice but to keep moving. Lucy was somewhere ahead, and the only way out was forward. The ballroom was quiet as Daisy, and I stepped further inside, the water rippling gently around our feet. And then, in the far corner of the room, two eyes appeared in the darkness. They blinked once. Slowly, and a deep voice rumbled out of the dark, echoing through the waterlogged space. The quiet ones, those trapped too long in the West Wing, with barely a grasp of their humanity left. They were monsters, yes, but not like Laverne, Bernard, or Jack. No, the quiet ones became something else. Something twisted. The dark, hollow version of what they once were. They loved to play games, to speak in riddles. Otherwise, they remained silent, watching and waiting. You may only pass if you answer my riddle. I froze. What? Daisy growled low beside me, her bony tail rattling faintly. Before I could react, more eyes appeared, one after the other, blinking into existence all around the room. Dozens, no, hundreds of eyes floating just above the waterline, surrounding us completely. I couldn't see their bodies, only the faint outlines of something shifting in the darkness. The water began to grow murky near the far corner, where a cluster of eyes was gathered. Something red was spreading in the water, staining it like ink. The voice spoke again. You may only pass if you answer my riddle. My mind raised as I forced myself to breathe steadily. Lady Laverne's advice echoed in my head. This wasn't a battle of strength. It was a battle of wits. What's the riddle? I asked. The monster's eyes narrowed slightly, and the voice spoke again. I am always hungry. I must always be fed. The more I drink, the more I grow. What am I? I repeated the words in my head, trying to focus. I'd heard this riddle before, but something about the way the monster asked it made me hesitate. Daisy growled again, and I glanced at her briefly. The eyes around us flickered, unblinking. They were waiting for me to fail. And then I remembered something, a detail from an old conversation with my mom. Back when I was a kid, riddles like this often had simple answers, but they also thrived on misdirection. Fire. The answer is fire, I said. The monster's eyes blinked slowly, and a faint rumble filled the room, almost like a growl of approval. You are correct. A chorus of low grumbles filled the room as the other eye shifted, clearly unhappy. The first monster spoke again, silencing the others. Get back. Let the human pass. One by one, the eyes disappeared, blinking out of existence, as if they'd never been there. The tension in the room eased slightly, though the water remained murky in places. All right, come on, girl, I said. Daisy followed close behind, her growl fading as we moved toward the far end of the ballroom. The broken doors on the other side led into another hallway, this one sloping upward. The dampness of the air gave way to something slightly cooler as we climbed. The path took us back upstairs into what felt like a more personal part of the West Wing. The walls here were still blackened and cracked, but they were lined with doors, bedrooms by the look of them. Each door was unique with faded brass plaques and peeling paint that hinted at their former elegance. Some were slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of ruined furniture and broken mirrors. Others were tightly shut, their locks rusted but intact. I passed one door that had been forced open, the room inside filled with the remnants of an old nursery. A broken rocking horse leaned against the wall, its painted eyes staring blankly into the empty space. The sight sent a chill through me, and I moved on quickly. Further down the hallway, we passed what looked like a study or private library. Books lay scattered across the floor, their pages brittle and yellow with age. A desk sat in the corner, its surface covered in tools and small mechanical parts. The hallway twisted again, leading us into a room that must have been a laboratory or invention room. The space was cluttered with tools. Hammers, screwdrivers, wrenches, and strange devices I couldn't name. Half-finished projects sat on workbenches, their purposes a mystery. Daisy sniffed at the ground, her bony legs stepping carefully over the debris. I kept the flashlight steady, scanning the room for anything that might hint at Lucy's whereabouts, and we headed out into the next hallway. The hallway stretched before me, splitting into 3 parts yet again. Each one looked just as dark and endless as the others. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the jar and unscrewed the lid. The last willow floated out, its faint blue glow, the only thing cutting through the darkness. Okay, show me the way. The wisp moved lightly in the air before darting forward, leaving its usual trail of blue light behind. Daisy and I followed, weaving through the narrow hallway as the wisp led us deeper into the west wing. But then it stopped. The corridor ended abruptly in a collapsed wall. Rubble filled the space, blocking any chance of moving forward. The wisp hovered in place, its glow pulsing steadily, as if it were waiting for something. I stared at the pile of debris. You gotta be kidding me. The willow wouldn't move, and there was no way through. I cursed softly, running a hand through my hair. I had no idea how to find another path, and now my last willow was useless. I felt Daisy press against my leg, her bony frame solid and grounded, even as the situation seemed hopeless. And then I remembered Jack. He'd said to call him if I needed help. I wasn't sure if he'd hear me or even if he'd come, but it was my only shot. Taking a deep breath, I called out softly, "Jack, can you hear me? I need your help." For a moment, nothing happened. The silence felt heavier, and I wondered if we were truly alone. And then from the far wall, Jack floated through, his head tucked under his arm like always. He looked rough. His usual charm and mischief were gone, replaced by an expression of unease. His form flickered slightly, like a candle burning low, and he glanced around nervously before speaking. "I hate this place. It's eating at me. What do you need, Tom? I'm stuck. The willow led us here, but there's no way through. I need you to help me find another path," I admitted, gesturing toward the collapsed corridor. Jack floated closer, his head tilting slightly as he surveyed the area. "Well, I can try, but I can't stay long. This wing drains me. It's worse for ghosts than it is for the living." I nodded. "I just need a way around," I said. Jack motioned for me to follow, floating ahead as he led Daisy and me through a series of twisting hallways. The path felt longer, more winding than before, and the further we went, the more Jack's presence seemed to dim. Finally, we stopped in front of a large, ornate door. The wood was scorched, the edges blackened from fire, but the intricate carvings of vines and roses were still visible. "This is it. The master bedroom and the heart of the curse," Jack said. He floated back slightly, keeping his distance from the door. "I can't stay here, Tom. I can feel it pulling at me, trying to twist me into something. You're close now, though. Whatever you're looking for, it's beyond this door." I looked at him, seeing how much it cost him to guide me here. "Thank you, Jack." He nodded, his expression softening. He glanced at Daisy and then back at me. "I hope I don't see you." On the other hand, he said, it was both a warning and a wish. I understood what he meant. He didn't want me to die here and become one of them. Another ghost trapped in the mansion forever. With a final look, Jack faded back through the wall, leaving Daisy and me alone in front of the door. I stood there for a moment, gathering my resolve. Whatever lay beyond, I had to face it. I wasn't leaving without Lucy. Daisy pressed against my side, her bony frame solid and unwavering. I reached down to give her a quick pat, and then I pushed the door open. The master bedroom was nothing like the rest of the West Wing. As I stepped inside, I was struck by how normal it looked. The walls were covered in floral wallpaper. The colors faded, but intact. A large canopy bed stood against one wall, its dark wood frame polished and smooth. The bed inside was neatly made, the covers pulled tight, as if someone had just left it that morning. There was a writing desk in the corner, an ink bottle, and a quill still sitting on its surface. A wardrobe stood open, revealing clothes from another era, neatly hung and untouched by time. Everything about the room felt like the master of the house had stepped out for a brief holiday and could return at any moment. It was the only part of the West Wing that wasn't burned, not even a scorch mark on the walls. The air felt heavy with silence, and for a moment I just stood there trying to make sense of it. Daisy walked in beside me, her bones clicking softly. I looked around, scanning the space for any sign of Lucy, but she wasn't there. And then I saw it. A single yellow daffodil rested on the writing desk. The flower was slightly wilted, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same one I'd given Lucy earlier in the greenhouse. My heart leapt at the sight of it. She'd been here. I picked up the daffodil gently, my thumb brushing over its delicate petals. It was proof I was on the right track. Lucy was close, but something about the room felt off. It was too perfect, too untouched. Every other part of the West Wing was ruined, but here it was like time had stood still. I glanced at Daisy, who was sniffing near the bookshelf. My eyes fell on a picture frame on the bedside table. I reached for it, lifting it carefully. Inside was a black and white photograph of two people in Victorian clothing. The man was tall and stern-looking, with sharp features and a heavy brow. I could only assume he was the master of the house, Mr. Hartwell. Beside him stood a woman, her face soft and smiling. She had an air of grace about her, but knowing the stories, I realized this was likely the woman who betrayed him. As I studied the photo, I heard a faint click behind me. I turned to see the bookshelf sliding to one side, revealing a narrow staircase leading upward. Daisy stood by the open space, her head tilted slightly, a book lying at her feet. "You did that, didn't you?" "Good girl," I said. I knelt down and patted her smooth skull. She wagged her bony tail, the rattling sound oddly comforting. I stepped toward the hidden staircase and glanced down at Daisy. "Okay, let's go." The staircase opened into what could only be described as a grand laboratory. The first thing I noticed was the massive ceiling window, high above, streaked with grime but still letting in the fading light of the setting sun. The orange glow poured into the room, casting long shadows over the chaos below. Drawers were overturned, papers spilling out across the floor. Every intact wall was covered with diagrams, blueprints, and blackboards filled with faded chalk markings. The fire had ravaged the space, too. The walls were blackened, the edges of the room crumbling where the fire had eaten away at the surface. But it wasn't just the damage that made my stomach turn. It was the gaping hole in the center of the room. Where the floor should have been, there was nothing but a jagged, empty chasm, a sharp drop into pure darkness. And then I saw her. Lucy stood at the far end of the room, balancing on a narrow wooden beam that stretched across the chasm. Her small frame was trembling, and her yellow raincoat stood out like a light bulb. But she wasn't alone. On the far side of the beam, towering over her, was a demon. It was massive. It didn't need to speak to let me know it was the master of the house, the cursed heart of this place. Its skin was cracked and dark, its limbs long and twisted. I could smell sulfur, and the heat coming from its body made the room feel like an oven. The demon didn't move, but it turned its head to look at me, and then it smiled. Lucy was crying now. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to be brave," she said. I forced my voice to stay calm. "It's okay." "You're okay," I said. Daisy barked, a sharp echoing sound that made the demon tilt its head slightly, its smile widening. I noticed something, then. Every time Lucy looked over at me, taking her eyes off the demon, it moved closer to her. Its steps were slow, deliberate, and silent, but it was gaining ground. "Lucy, wait, stop. Don't look away from it. Remember what I told you in the greenhouse? You have to look at it. Don't take your eyes off him no matter what." She sniffled, her small shoulders trembling, but she nodded. You can do this. Just keep your eyes on him and walk slowly backward toward me. I'll guide you the whole way, okay? I'm right here, Lucy. Lucy took a deep breath, steeling herself. She turned her body carefully, so her back was toward me, while her eyes remained locked on the demon's step by shaky step. She began to move. I talked to her the whole time. That's it. That's it. One step at a time. You're doing great. I'm right here. Daisy stood beside me, her tail rattling softly as she watched Lucy move across the beam. My heart pounded with every step. The beam was narrow, and the drop below was terrible. The room began to shake, the vibrations rattling the debris around us. Lucy let out a yelp as her foot slipped, but she caught herself just in time. The demon laughed, but it still didn't move as long as Lucy's eyes stayed on it. That's it. That's it. You're almost there. Just a few more steps. Lucy's small feet shuffled backward, her face pale but determined. Her eyes stayed locked on the demon. It smiled horribly at her, and she fought back tears. Finally, she reached the edge of the chasm, and I reached out quickly, scooping her into my arms. She was shaking. You did good, Lucy. You did so good. I didn't let go of her, keeping my arms wrapped around her as I slowly backed away from the beam. Daisy stayed by my side, growling low but steady as she kept her focus on the demon. The room shook harder now, the heat growing unbearable. The demon's eyes followed us, and it kept smiling. I didn't turn my back until we rounded the corner, putting the demon out of sight. The heat was overwhelming. The shaking was getting worse, but I pushed forward. We'd made it this far, and I wasn't stopping now. Lucy clung tightly to me as I carried her, small frame trembling. Daisy stayed close, her bony legs rattling softly with every step I took. I was trying to retrace our path, but the west wing was a maze and the shaking of the ground made every step feel uncertain. The heat was getting worse, and I could see faint flickers of fire starting to spread along the edges of the room behind us. My grip on Lucy tightened as I realized we didn't have much time. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the jar. The willows had already run out of energy, their glow fading long ago. But I held the jar tightly, staring at it as I walked. Please help us. If what they say is true, you help good people. She's just a kid. For a moment, nothing happened. And then faintly, a soft blue glow began to pulse inside the jar. One by one, the willows reappeared, their light brighter than ever. They floated upward, their energy renewed, and I felt the surge of hope as they began to circle us. The lead willow shot forward, leaving a clear trail of blue light behind it. The others followed, weaving together in a glowing path that cut through the darkness ahead. All right, come on, Daisy, let's go, I said. Daisy barked once, her tail rattling as she kept close to my side. The willows guided us quickly through the west wing, taking twists and turns I never would have remembered on my own. The blue light cut through the gloom, and I focused on the path ahead. Ignoring the fire behind us, the ground shook harder and pieces of the ceiling began to fall, but the willows moved faster, their glow unwavering. I kept my eyes on them, following their trail with Daisy right beside me. Lucy clung to me the entire time. The fire grew closer, licking at the walls and spreading. The heat was unbearable, and I could feel sweat pouring down my face. But the willows didn't falter. They stayed bright, their blue light leading us through collapsing hallways and over unstable ground. Finally, just as the trail of blue began to dim, I saw the entrance to the west wing ahead. Count Bernard stood there, his tall frame imposing even in the chaos. He held Lady Laverne's crystal ball carefully in one hand, her face swirling faintly inside the glass. O'Reilly was at his side, his face tight with worry, and Headless Jack hovered just behind them. O'Reilly called out to me, waving his arms over his head. I pushed forward until I stumbled out of the west wing and into the safety of the main mansion. Daisy followed, her bones rattling as she barked sharply. Bernard gave a quick nod of approval. Jack floated closer, his eyes scanning Lucy before looking at me. You look terrible, he said. I managed a weak smile, my knees nearly giving out as I set Lucy on the ground. She stood shakily, her hands still clutching mine. You're alive. Miracles do happen, it seems, Lady Laverne said, her voice echoing faintly from the crystal ball. The others murmured their agreement, though Jack's expression darkened as he glanced back toward the West Wing. That place should never be opened again, he said a little later. After things had calmed down and the fires had been extinguished, Lucy and I sat together in the garden outside the mansion. Daisy lay nearby, her bony tail wagging. Lucy looked up at me, her big eyes filled with guilt. Thank you for saving me, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cause so much trouble. I shook my head, giving her a small smile. There's nothing to be sorry for. You were brave. She blinked, tilting her head. I nodded. Yeah, you were brave enough to face the monster. Brave enough to walk across that beam, even when it was scary. It's a lot more than most people could do. Really? She asked again. Yeah, really. You're the bravest light bulb I know. She smiled at that. The mansion still loomed behind us, its secrets buried deep within its walls. But for now, we were safe, and that was all that mattered. After the incident with Lucy, Riley and I agreed the West Wing needed to be sealed off for good. We couldn't risk anyone else wandering in there, especially not kids. For weeks, we worked on renovations, putting up thin walls of plaster to block off the entrances. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best we could do. The mansion didn't make it easy, as if the West Wing itself resisted being hidden. Still, we kept going, covering doorways and making the space blend in with the rest of the house. When we were done, the West Wing was concealed. The entrance was gone, hidden behind plain walls that gave no clue to what lay beyond. It wasn't much, but it was a lot better than leaving it open. Life at the mansion slowly returned to normal, or at least what passed for normal here. The tours resumed, with visitors marveling at the history and supposed special effects. They laughed, screamed, took pictures, completely unaware of how real the mansion's secrets were. Inside, the monsters carried on as they always had. Headless Jack popped up unexpectedly in hallways, cracking jokes and scaring visitors in his usual charming way. Lady Laverne stayed in her crystal ball, loudly criticizing the curtains and furniture any chance she got. Count Bernard still grumbled about the cook's food, even though he never tasted it. Some things never changed. For Maine, life settled back into its usual rhythm. The gardens always needed work, and I found comfort in tending the flower beds and trimming the hedges. Daisy was my constant companion, trotting beside me with her rattling steps and wagging tail. She never strayed far, even on long days when the sun beat down or the wind swept through the grounds. I found myself planting more daffodils around a mansion, their bright yellow blooms bringing a sense of warmth to the old weathered stone one evening. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft hues of orange and purple, I stood in the garden, a spade in one hand and a tray of daffodil bulbs in the other. I glanced up at the mansion, my eyes lingering on the West Wing. From the outside, it looked the same as always, its towering walls unyielding and still. But I knew the truth. I knelt in the dirt and planted another bulb, pressing the soil gently around it. Daisy lay nearby, her bony frame stretched out as she watched me work. I paused for a moment, and I thought about all that had happened. Lucy was safe, and Daisy and I had both survived. I just hope that whatever's inside the West Wing is hidden now, and that no one else ever finds it.